Welcome to Mandala. Today, everyone, 30th of October 2024. Previous programs, I've been discussing how much I feel as though recorded music right now, at least when it's good, is quite underrated, and I feel as though it doesn't often get the praise it deserves, either from older music fans or people interested in new music now, listening to things that I think are generally objectively a lot worse. But I realised during the 2010s, where, you know, I was the ages of like 13 to 23 in the 2010s. So I'm actually the prime music demographic of the 2010s.
I never thought about that. That's true.
So I can safely say the music that was being pushed to me at this time, both the sort of chart garbage and the stuff that was meant to be acclaimed and eclectic and interesting and forward-thinking,
And foster the people.
It was crap. It was basically, a lot of it was crap. And like a lot of the things that Fisher said in that 2014 Slow Cancellation of the Future talk, you watched it on YouTube, very famous, my first exposure to him, and as well as many other people's.
Yeah.
He was right about, as someone who was turned 18 that year, he was right about 2014. Now, I think music shifted in a way that was a little more interesting afterward, almost in response to it, at least after people became aware of who he was and his thinking after he passed away in early 2017.
Yeah, well, your first album would have horrified him if he was around to hear it.
Maybe, I'm not sure about that.
He could have liked it because it is quite quality, but at least aesthetically.
But there was an interesting, distinct philosophic disposition on that particular album in question. And the reason I bring up the 2010s is because my theme today is actually myself trying to find some redeemable qualities in the 2010s. Well, don't get me wrong, like there are albums from the 2010s that were quite brilliant, and I've praised them here before, and I may as well just go over it again and hear people go, oh, what about... Yeah, of course, you know, DJ Roswell's None of This Is Real. That's a really brilliant little thing from 2014, which, you know, I could discuss that on Mandala, but I've got a video of cosmic criticism on it, so I really couldn't be bothered repeating myself, at least in that case. I'm a big champion of Eno and Hyde's album Someday World from 2014. It's arguably one of the more interesting things in the Eno story.
Yeah.
In the grand scheme of things.
Especially in his more like, what would you say, like pop or rock sort of material.
Yeah, and like in the vein of, and I actually like it more than, not disrespect to the Wrong Way Up of John Cale. I'd rather listen to Someday World, personally.
I'm such a simp for Wrong Way Up. I love that album.
Fair enough.
It's the cheesy like MIDI synth noises and like strings and stuff, you know. It kind of sounds a bit like sophisti pop, funnily enough, or
yes.
Even a bit that a less garage version of that Martin Newell Andy Partridge record.
Oh, cool! Yeah.
But yeah, the Eno and what was the other guy's name?
Carl Hyde from Underworld.
That's a bit more out there and a bit more idiosyncratic. So
totally,
you know, they Wrong Way Up you'd think would be idiosyncratic, but it's not at all. You know,
of some of the so-called forward-thinking hip-hop that was pushed toward us, you know, some of it was great. And even some of the stuff that was a little bit more old school at that time was doing great. Cannibal Ox's second album, which is Blade of the Rona from 2015, some people might complain it's a bit too regressive. I think that's still the consensus. It has like 2-point-something on RYM for whatever reason. But I think it's quite brilliant. It's not quite the same as the original, but, you know, they don't have ELP producing and... you know, it's just different times, you know, like you come back and try to top the original. Hey, it's a hell of a lot better than when the Avalanches came back. Let's put it like that.
Sure. I don't know how the Tribe Called Quest comeback was that good, honestly.
That's quite good.
For a comeback album, you don't even notice.
I'll actually bring that up in a moment. But, you know, onto forward-thinking hip-hop, you know, you got to give credit to Lil Ugly Mane on Oblivion Access, Kanye on Life of Pablo, Mac Homie on Dump Meister, Vince Staples on Big Fish Theory. That's amazing.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
I quite like the Brockhampton albums that came out in 2017, the Saturation Trilogy.
Okay.
And
is there 3 of them?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Some interesting sort of, dare I say, Animal Collective-esque R&B. They're like really abrasive, weirdo sort of material.
Like maximalist R&B.
Yeah, it's almost like where Animal Collective, the middle ground between something like Death's Dynamic Shroud or recent Magdalena Bay Now.
Sure.
And then where Animal Collective aren't doing what, you know, these groups are.
Funnily enough, I was going to bring this up later anyway, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, to be fair, Animal Collective did put out Painting With in 2016, which is very good.
Sure.
But again, like, if we're going to be really particular about, you know, what really blew me away is like, you know, whatever. We can seem slightly ungrateful at times. Yeah. But also from the 2010s, very forward-thinking, right at the end of the decade, Injury Reserve self-titled. Yeah, absolutely sensational. And much praise for that. But so yeah, just that was just me, kind of my obligatory. Okay, yeah, there was some cool stuff in the 2010s, but take some stuff that was pushed to us by artists such as like Kendrick Lamar, most of Def Grips, Danny Brown, Frank Ocean to an extent, Sufjan Stevens. Like, that stuff's good, but it's not the best music anyone's ever heard. Like, let's be real, guys.
Sure.
The Freddie Gibbs and Madlib stuff isn't as great as people say it is. Like that, I used to like that Illinois album, but now it just kind of just like really like viscerally annoys me. I don't know what changed it, but I guess I just got a little bit older, for better or for worse. The car seat headrest stuff, that drives me up a fucking wall.
Yeah.
Ways Blood, overrated. Look, Tribe Called Quest, that's a good album, but if any decade where it's like the 16th best rated album, it's like, really, guys?
I wouldn't say it's the 16th best album, no way.
Yeah, like maybe one of the 90s Tribe albums in their context. I mean, I wouldn't put it that high, but like I can understand why you put Low End Theory or something.
Maybe in like a top 100 or something.
Oh yeah, definitely 100. I mean, they're very evocative, powerful works, and I'm quite fond of the beat rhymes in life in particular. I think that's quite...
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's gotten more of a reappraisal now, but that's always one I really gravitated to.
The three from Low End Theory up through to Beats and Rhymes, those are the three best ones in my mind.
Yeah. The one I tend to find the most appreciation for now is Marauders, actually.
Yeah.
I heard some people,
like
people talking up like the bass on that, and I'm kind of like, was sort of taken by that comment. Now I can't unhear like how powerful like this kind of succinct, strong bass sound is.
Yeah.
Very compressed and pretty, interestingly enough. But also like Kids See Ghost is good, but again, like to say that that's the best the decade has to offer is quite.
I listened to that once, thought it was really cool, and haven't listened to it again. So there you go. You know, it's sort of one of those.
You could say the same thing about the some rap songs by El Sweatshirt, which is pretty good. And I'd say the same thing about like that LCZ Sound System album's good, but it's hardly the best any decade has to offer.
Yeah.
I don't like Travis Scott very much. That Brave Little Abacus album, that's pretty good. I don't know if it's the best this decade has to offer. I'm a big fan of The Daughters. You won't get what you want. Like, look, if anyone who's listened to this programs thus far, they know that's an album that's sort of catering to my tastes quite particularly. So, like, what am I going to do but like think that's
sort
cool.
of an arty, like, hardcore album.
Yeah. But then moving on, the other kind of music I'm interested in hearing in 2016. Like, I like some of the retro sort of synth pop stuff. I quite like the turn that Arcade Fire took in 2013 after not being the biggest fan of their 2000s. I think the last one was like 2010. Neon Bible or whatever from 2010.
The Reflected, like, new disco.
Yeah, Reflected was really good. But my issue with a lot of that synth pop stuff is a lot of it's very kind of cutesy and sort of like ha-ha. Whereas like Choir Boy, Passive If Desire, is not so much a synth pop revival, but specifically a new Romantic Associates era sort of new Simple Minds revival.
Yeah.
And rather specifically, they're very emotional sort of thrust of the music. This isn't like retro. This is whereas other bands wanted to turn this music into hacky sort of American football-esque Midwest slowcore, emo-core. This decided to take that sort of that, and rather than be posers with it, decided to be sort of like, dare I say, like, have the bravery, the courageousness of putting it in this sort of like seemingly gimmicky but really quite exposing sort of like I think it takes a lot to sort of dress up and present yourselves in this way and do it in a way that's like slightly humorous but also very sort of confessional and sort of very like it's placing oneself out there emotionally in a way that I feel like the slowcore artists, like, at the end of the day, you're just putting yourselves in like a pseudo sexy archetype. Maybe some people do find it sexy, I don't know.
No,
but like I find a lot of that phony.
Archetype.
Yeah, and it's just phony. It's like you've just found a little clique and you're just trying to fit into it. Whereas like these guys wouldn't quite fit in with the retro synth pop guys because they're not like humorous and sort of like want to be Devo enough. And I don't think they're really fitting in with more depressing, sort of dominant depressing styles of alt indie music at that time either. I don't know who this was for popularly. If I'd have heard it at the time, I would have really enjoyed it. And I really like it now because, I mean, at that time I hadn't gotten into Associates. I didn't really know who they were at the time. But getting all the earlier, say, New Gold Dream sort of style of the Simple Minds, I mean, the later crappier Simple Minds we all did, sadly, this is really catering to that sort of really bouncy maximalist era where a lot of synth pop is minimal and a lot of the new romantic stuff is very sort of conversely maximal.
Yeah.
The technology moved forward.
And washes of synths and like those deep drums and stuff like that, for sure.
Yeah, and it was a lot more to be... Obviously, the sounds moved on and sort of fashion moved on, and like that decade moved on to the more kind of sleek sort of Pet Shop Boys sort of sounds, or like more like urban R&B sounds from America, say, sort of counteract that British invasion going on at the time. But at the end of the decade there... But yeah, so Choir Boy does the interesting thing of sort of honing in on that sort of 82, 83 moment, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
And then before sort of this seemingly DAF-inspired thing, going to Frankie Goes to Hollywood seems to inspire then Pet Shop Boys going forward, that sort of sleek, sort of like leather look rather than the sort of flowery, sort of like, you know, Marie Antoinette look.
Yeah.
Obviously New Romantic era.
Sure.
But, and then the Choir Boys seem to have like sort of distilled that sound into a modern context. Like we were praising about Ali X, the recent program, you know, taking more with a certain older analog synthesizer style from the early mid 80s, and incorporating that sonic and what the technology, the pop priorities that the technology sort of demanded, and sort of extrapolating those and using the sort of more the malleability of digital technology to do more with, to some extent. Obviously, they are going for a certain degree of minimalism compared to some of the more epic bravura of maybe some of Associates' sulk songs, which could be Cure-esque at times. This is more... go on.
It's more like that first Blue Nile album.
Oh yeah, cool.
That sort of thing. But,
Sophisti-pop touches.
Yeah. And also, like, I even showed it to one of my mates at work quickly, and he's like... I just was like, oh, listen to this. What year is this from? And he's like, it's straight out of 1984.
Ooh.
I was like, nice. But funnily enough, the band I was thinking of, like you cited a few other things, I was thinking less of like a Midwest emo thing, and more along the lines of, you remember, like, you know how you said this is more authentic, like, it's not even a revival in a way, it's like just a reimagining, or like a genre that didn't get its time in the sun for very long, fully imagining itself many years later.
Yeah. And
the thing I was thinking of in comparison to is, do you remember Empire of the Sun?
Oh, yeah.
On a Dream.
Yeah.
That's like a synth, like, pastiche from around that time.
Do you remember Pnow Wild Strawberries? Yeah. I adore that song. Well, I don't like Empire of the Sun.
Empire of the Sun's that guy. And
oh, is it?
Yeah,
okay,
it's that guy and Sleepy Jackson's singer.
I barely,
two Australian things. But yeah, it's like heaps of bands were more in that sort of vein. Like a pastiche sort of thing, you know, rather than like a sort of full realization. Like, the way I could think about it was, like, some of the people from even back in the New Romantic day, like, they sort of look at me sideways when I've mentioned before that there's a sort of like transcendental like romanticism to Alphaville, you know, that Forever Young song. I'm like, man, there's just something about that with the sweeping synths. It's very new romantic, and it sort of reaches for the heavens, you know, and that's sort of what this goes for. And I think I was thinking why that sort of sound was, or like I said, a bit of the Blue Nile. On here, the sort of slower songs sound a bit like Talk, especially when they go in that sort of stranger direction.
Talk at that time.
Especially the muted like drums, like those muted electronic drums are kind of like that. And I was thinking, like, why was this sound sort of derided at the time, especially by, like, you know, sort of punks or like post-punks, and maybe, like you said, DAF, people who got into more of the rigid sort of mechanical synth pop. And I think it's because, like, this sort of music was the sounds they probably heard coming from their sister's bedroom.
Yeah.
Whereas now it's like, you know, beyond that little point in time, it being like, you know, adolescent girl music essentially. It's able to sort of mature and realize itself as a sort of like a truly transcendental, like, romantic sound, you know. It's not just a sort of a teenage yearning or something. And I thought that was interesting. So in a way, like, the Blue Nile or Talk can really flourish more in the 2010s somehow. Yeah, I thought it was neat like that. And, like, the sort of second half of the album is a bit dirgier, whereas the first half is a bit poppier. Synth pop albums seem to fall into that sort of sequencing. But that third song, if that was an 80s song, I forget what it's called. But
it's called Leave Me Be?
Yeah, that would have been a massive hit. That's just got that hyper anthemic, like, very melodic chorus. It just, you know, it's the best of that. Some new romantics were good at doing those without it sounding like when the sort of American radio 80s took over, they took the tropes from that and turned it into those terrible, like, mid to late 80s, like, ballad things. And they completely ruined that sound, or misinterpreted like an English sound or whatever. Is this group from England?
No, this is an American group. It's funny. Wow. They're from Salt Lake City, Utah.
Utah?
Yeah.
There you go. I thought they outlawed music in Utah.
Yeah, you'd think so. But no.
Maybe just music that's after the 1980s.
Yeah, no. What appealed to me about this, well, aside from the fact that it's just kind of really sonically, consistently enjoyable, kind of hooky and fun and upbeat, but also sort of like gratifying, smart songwriting and arrangements, electronic, and but in sort of a timeless, like sort of just melodic sense, but also just the electronics really just bump it all up, as in I guess the best of these sort of synth pop adjacent or sort of revival artists, but just the fact that I like that there are groups operating within this sort of world continuum during the 2010s that it wasn't a nostalgia sort of fetishism, but it was sort of part of that like sort of emotional alt rock wave, but indie wave, but propelled via a sort of more synth pop new romantic styling instead. And best of all, it's that gimmick's all well and good, but it does do the songs hold up. I would say very much so.
Yeah, easily.
I would recommend it to a lot of people who are interested in this idea. I think it nails it, and it's got a quite fairly high rating here. So on RYM, it seems like a lot of other people feel that way also.
I've seen the cover before. When that little ad thing pops up,
Oh, sure.
It goes through various little like top rating lists or whatever.
Yeah.
And when synth pops come up, I've seen that little icon because there's two people like dressed as vampires.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, that looks interesting. I wonder what that sounds like.
Yeah.
And I did not picture it sounding like this. I was actually quite surprised. This is a pretty killer album. And like you said, there's no element of like sort of like revival pastiche or some sort of thing like that. It's like a really earnest, authentic sort of piece,
Well, the albums are just like there'd be more like irony and sarcasm than there would be, but it's rather just like kind of putting it all out there, as I said, emotionally, which is the more daring thing and the more edgy sort of like, dare I say, like kind of fascinating against the grain thing to do compared to just like LARPing as Devo or whatever.
Yeah. Well, that's new romanticism through and through. There's no, literally sarcasm doesn't exist in its vernacular.
In a way, it could be more sincere than some of the new romantic stuff because they were just like sort of trying to fit in and sort of like adhere to a clique. Whereas this is just they don't know clique that's like sort of has any forward momentum going for it where Choir Boy can fit in. You know what I mean? Like unless they just stand on their own merits. You know
that's
what I mean?
Why
no one's getting points for doing this sort of sound in and of itself. Whereas in the early to mid 80s, like that was just the easiest way to get a record deal for like a maybe 7-month period. You know?
Like Ricky Gervais
in London. Oh sure, yeah. Dancing Siona or whatever that's called. Siona Dancing, excuse me. But anyway, Choir Boy, Positive Desire, very highly recommended by myself certainly.
Yeah, no, I agree. I thought this album was awesome.
Yeah, and that being said, will we be moving on to the next release as of...
Yeah, funnily enough, I didn't even think about it, but it's Halloween, like tomorrow or the day after.
Uh-huh.
And my first choice is Hex by Poison Girls. Which, I don't know, I kind of like the idea of starting these shows every now and then with these like 30-minute punk albums.
Yeah.
Especially ones that are like pretty deep from my history, that because of the show I've sort of gone back and just like, because I heard it years ago a bunch of times, so I never really like listened to this sort of like this or The Naked Ray Gun, like those sort of albums. It's been nice to like revisit them and just be like sort of remembering being like 20 years old and just getting into these sort of ideas and stuff. One thing I never realized though, in the case of this group, because it's mostly a female singer. Mm-hmm. I never realized that when these albums, the Poison Girls albums were released, she was in like her 40s.
Well, to be honest, it almost sounds a little bit.
Yeah, I just assumed they were like all young or whatever. But yeah, she, which really is understandable because like there's a weird sort of, like a lived, learned sort of theme to all the sort of songs and stuff, and they're very just like in your face. Like I find the concept of anarcho-punk very interesting because it's like not hardcore, it's not post-punk, but even though punk and hardcore and post-punk is often like political, anarcho-punk is like its own type of political.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating sort of genre, and yeah, it's like, you know, in the race for punk rock to be authentic, anarcho-punk is like, I guess the only way you can distinguish it is the one saying we're the actual most authentic ones, you know.
Maybe.
And so that's the sort of attitude I feel you get from like anarcho-punk albums. Sometimes it's like really obnoxious in the sort of Ian MacKaye way, but even though he sometimes isn't too obnoxious, I guess more Henry Rollins is probably a better example. Whereas something like this is just, yeah, for like a hardcore album, like it goes more out there than American hardcore does. I think that's why I sort of, when I first listened to these guys, you know, it was after being into bands like, you know, Minor Threat or Black Flag, and I was like, man, this is like the real out there, like punk, you know?
Yeah.
Because they just mix in these short, bursty, like thrashy songs with, you know, sort of off-kilter funk, like, you know, post-punk bits, and then just like experimental noise that'll lead into like a disco beat that'll, you know, for a hardcore album, there's a lot of musical variety on it. So, like, even more than I remember, though I do remember that the next album they have, Chappaquiddick Bridge, is like even more sort of out there.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, whereas this one's a bit more sort of honed in. But yeah, it's an album that sort of kicks ass, and in a way, like, the similar sort of things around it, this sort of like feminist hardcore or whatever.
Yeah.
In comparison to something like Au Pairs or like the Slits or something like that.
Raincoats.
Yeah, Raincoats. This one feels like it comes from less the university and more like the real world, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like I was realizing that just listening to it recently, just how like raw it is. Like it's very domestic. There's not many punk, you know, most punk concepts and like political concepts come from an angle of like, you know, urban collective action and stuff like that.
Yeah.
As opposed to this idea of like the sort of domestic unbliss that was especially like probably this lady's life in like 70s England, where she's essentially just like a slave to a husband and like has to like completely raise the kids on her own. But then sort of is probably working classes, like similar to her husband, so they have to contemplate whether they can leave the kids outside the pub and shit like that, you know?
Yeah.
It just feels like a very real, like, lived experience.
Sorry.
No, that's alright. Some Brian Eno rip-off noises. Yeah, it's just, like, there's a lot I could say about this album. You just sort of have to listen to it yourself to, like, it's like a British kitchen sink, like, movie in album form in a way, you know? It's Kathy Come Home, the album.
Yeah, for perspective, the vocalist V. Subversa, her title is, she was born in 1935.
Wow.
And this is from 1979.
Yeah, she's in like mid-40s, I guess.
Yeah.
And she sounds a bit like the Art Bears singer.
Oh, yeah, Dagmar Kraus, what's her name?
Yeah, it's Dagmar Kraus, I'm pretty sure.
Dagmar Kraus, I gotta know this, yeah.
A sort of strange, like, squeaky wail, almost like operatic, like vaudeville sort of thing.
Dagmar Kraus, yeah, of course, I got that right.
Yeah,
good.
Nice. It's just a 30-minute punk rock album. I don't know. I just find it very, very fascinating. It's just very lived in, and there's just something about like I just feel there's something lost in translation in this early wave of like Au Pairs, like, you know, Poison Girls, Slits, Raincoats, sort of punk that just like I was thinking about it recently because that terrible Australian band, and I'm just like, man, it's such a shame that like it seems that like in the case of that Australian band, like the whole feminist angle is that like she's like showing her tits in like the campaign, like the music video and all the promotional stuff. And then half the songs on the album is about how she's like an object of sexual desire that no one can have. Yeah. And it's like the lamest like feminist sort of like posturing. It's it's like taking the opposite idea of what these earlier bands, especially like Poison Girls, where they're like trapped by the male id. It's like the male id is this like thing that women have to, their whole existence is like appealing to. And then in the contemporary sense, you get like someone who's like deliberately setting off the male id and then like wagging a finger. It reminds me of like, it's like the depth of waving a banana at the chimpanzee cage at the zoo. Yeah. And then being like, oh look, they're getting rolled up.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, it's a weird sort of like feedback loop that it isn't like properly asserted or self-realized. In the way that something like this lady, you just feel like in Poison Girls, what was her name?
Vice versa.
Vice versa. Yeah, you feel her pain and her like anguish and her sort of like, it's very cathartic. Just the way she exchanges all that energy on this album. It really is like punk rock at its best in a way. I don't know. That's my feeling on this album. It's not for everyone. What do you reckon?
Oh well, I was just gonna say the other definitely probably non-university sort of like female punk, sort of the sort of icon is, I would say probably New York's Lydia Lunch seems to fall into that.
Oh yeah, the no wave.
Teenage Jesus and the Jerks.
Yeah, that she was in. Yeah, nice.
She has a podcast now where she's
really
she interviews certain people. I found out about it because Mark Ames was a guest on there once, and it's an interesting listen. And she can dominate some of the conversation sometimes, going on her own rants. She's a very active character.
Yeah. She has some infamous thing where she was like ragging on that Nardwar guy. Oh yeah. Fuck yeah, I love Lydia Lunch.
Yeah, but no, I actually thought this is excellent, and it makes me think of how there really was like an absurd amount of potency to this new punk ethos, I guess quasi-revolution, and I've tried to distill it what that was in these sort of improvised sort of off top of my head sort of spiels in previous Mandala programs episodes, and I realize like what it really boils down to is an idea that you're similarly artistically convicted as the artists on the major labels putting out very expensive records. But you're obsessed with sort of a DIY sort of like integrity and also a certain, what should we say, like a certain vague, not disdain, but like indifference to what can be identified as formalism in prior, certainly in a lot of the major rock music that was existing kind of at that point in the 70s. And in retrospect, you look at a lot of like the big rock albums, even something like David Bowie's, like maybe the electronic ones less so, but like they're these big sort of like bulbous rock epics where you listen to them and they tell a story. It's like it's a big experience. Who's Next, Dark Side of the Moon, Fleetwood Mac, obviously all the progressive rock albums. But and it gets a bit like the Zeppelin albums certainly. And it's just all a bit like Queen, and it's just like it doesn't really like it's just going to keep going like this forever and forever and forever. And like just the organic next step was to kind of like make it raw and raucous. I mean, this was being realized concurrently. Like a lot of glam rock bands were arguably falling into this. Like T-Rex, David Bowie was a bit sort of larger than life, but not that Mark Bolan was. I mean, Mark Bolan wasn't claiming to be from outer space, to be fair. I mean, not that he wasn't larger than life, but Mark Bolan, like T-Rex, and then, we see the Stooges in America and the sort of Iggy and the Stooges form in the early 70s with Williamson on guitar, and also several little groups, I guess the New York Dolls in a way, but I was never as into their music, which is kind of uncaptivating to me. But the point is, it's like, what the Sex Pistols kind of unveils, and what especially a group like, I think the more interesting group in the long run is Magazine, because Magazine found a way to be like sort of really art rocky while sort of remaining sort of loyal to that punk idiom. And I'm fascinated by the idea of Magazine sort of putting people off by being not punk enough, because Magazine would never sort of court the Pink Floyd or sort of like Yes fans. I mean, unless they were sort of the smarter of the Yes fans. But it's just one of those things where it was amazing how much like could be done, because that formalism is really sort of stifling creatively, but when you could sort of just like choose all of the rules as you went along, but also like because you were so artistically serious and had a great passion and conviction for it, you were going to have some degree of discipline and like vague formality, but it would be a formality that's sort of seamless, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which is like, we've compared Deceit by This Heat before to Dark Side of the Moon, but there's no contrivances to Deceit, even though it is a very sort of similarly philosophically serious recording with a sort of cycle that's very thought about and considered.
Sure.
And I think what's interesting about a record like Poison Girls, it's occupying a sort of like avant-garde realm similar to sort of like the intentions of, not that it sounds similar to, but like, you know, electroacoustic recording artists in like the late 60s, you know what I mean?
Sure.
It's like, let's explore the perimeters of recognizable melodies and rhythms, and then but it's doing it within sort of this like protest punk sort of paradigm, and it's creating a sort of like really interesting form of, in its own way, like minimalist art music. And I'd like to now read out someone whose thoughts I found very, very validating and empowering. I was reading interview that Simon Reynolds conducted with Grail Marcus. Now, who's Grail Marcus? He's an American rock critic, and I became familiar with him because Mark Fisher on K-Punk would often advocate for this book that Grail Marcus published in the late 1980s called Lipstick Traces. It's like a secret history of punk rock and some other like sort of countercultural sort of underground movements in the Western, like English-speaking world, and particularly England and America at least.
Sure.
Focus on America, I suppose, because that's where Grail Marcus is from.
Yeah.
But the Sex Pistols plays an enormous focus, and Mark Fisher claimed that this was like an enormously influential book upon him, partly because, and this is as K-punk as it gets, what Grail Marcus did was he used the metaphor of what's it called? Well, we know it as the film Quatermass in the Pit, but in America it was known as it was like 10 million years to Earth or something. 5 million years to Earth, not to be confused with 20 million miles to Earth, the Ray Harryhausen film from the late 50s, which Ymir, the monster from that film, he later rocks up on a Joy Division bootleg titled The Visitor. Nice. So that's an interesting connection it has. But the reason that's important slightly is because he used the metaphor of Quatermass in the Pit. He wrote it as 5 million years to Earth, and then there's sort of the concept of like almost Scientology-esque, frankly, a little bit with the meaning of this joke, I suppose, but the concept kind of proposed in Neil's Quatermass in the Pit, that at the dawn of humanity were these like sort of, you know, dying, sort of like raving, frenetic Martian influences, which sort of like affected a large number of the species, and sort of the origins of a lot of sort of more aggressive and hostile pathologies could be rooted in the initial impact that this Martian object with this hive, this swarm, had upon the human species. And Grail Marcus' utilization of this apparently triggered something in Mark Fisher, which he cited a couple of times in blog posts, and then he referred to the book itself, and I'm like, oh, wow, that's amazing. Like, you know, tying like two things, which I'm very fond of, the Neil Quatermass and the Pit, Nigel Neal, and that film in particular, the Hammer film adaptation. It's very, very, very brilliant work. And just tying it in with like something which we also had great admiration and fascination for, the punk continuum, and just tying those two things together in a manner that was obvious and you can't unsee once you've learnt it. But like, you wish you'd made that yourself, because you're like, well, of course. Anyway, I'm going to read what Grail Marcus had, some of this excerpts of this interview. Okay. This is Marcus. When I saw the Sex Pistols at Winterland, which was their last show in San Francisco, January of 1978, I was 32. That seems pretty young now. I'm more than twice that age. I had 2 kids, had been married for almost 12 years, but I was a writer. I was writing for Rolling Stone, and I wrote about that show for Rolling Stone. And I didn't feel there was no one was excluded at that show. There were all kinds of people at that show. People you hadn't seen for years, people you saw all the time, people you wondered where in the world they came from. There was Michael McClure on stage, reading poetry during breaks between shows. He was born in the 1930s in Wichita. He came to San Francisco in the 1950s as part of the Beat movement. And Richard Meltzer was up there on stage reading poetry too. He's got the Sex Pistols and the Avengers and the Nuns. And yeah, if you don't get it, then you can say you're too old. But if you do get it, then you're not too anything. You're really lucky to be there. And continuing, this is an answer to another question of Reynolds. The question from Reynolds got quite long, so I just jumped straight to Marcus's answer, and it sort of you get the tenor of what the question was. That's the important thing is the answer, of course. Otherwise, that's why the question's being offered. Around Cream magazine, people tried so hard to embrace what Patti Smith was doing, what Slade was doing, what whoever was doing as the sign of a brand new day. But really, it wasn't until the Sex Pistols arrived. As far as the American stuff that was going on earlier than that, looking back, it's only with Rockets from the Tombs and Pierre Ubu in Cleveland there was something truly special happening. And I didn't know what they were doing at the time it was happening. That was my own closed-mindedness and pig-headedness, because the record store I spent so much time in Berkeley in those days, Rather Ripped Records, had all the Pierre Ubu singles when they came out in 75. I couldn't hear them then, and the Rocket from the Tomb stuff had not been released at that time, so I didn't know any of the great things that Peter Lorre had done. But as far as I'm concerned, that's where something truly special is happening in this country. And now I'm just scrolling to the bottom here to find the other passage of the interview, which I found intriguing. Hold on, sorry everyone.
Yeah, Pierre Ubu, man. For
those first, who very few people have a better first three albums than Pierre Ubu.
Especially
and like a slightly more disappointing remainder of the. I don't know it as well, but the albums 3 and 4. There's one from the 80s that's quite good. I think it's album 5. But the fourth one of Mayo Thompson, it's like there's a question. There's a question is, can the avant-garde sort of craziness, no rules, noise, whatever, can it go too far as the conservative critics claims it does all the time? And the answer was offered up to us by Mayo Thompson and Pierre Ubu on that fourth album. Yes, it fucking can.
Yeah,
sorry guys.
It's pretty out there.
It's like, I love Henry Cow, I love Art Zoid, I love... No, you know what's too far for me? The Cardiacs is too far for me. Fuck that shit.
And it's also not Metal Machine music either.
Well, that's just a bad example of that genre. Like, I love Stockhausen, but Metal Machine music and Subotnik.
Well, that's what I mean. It's just too far, you know. Whereas Stockhausen and like Subotnik have a bit of, you know.
Stockhausen is the entertainment aspect of Stockhausen is underrated, included by his apparent admirers.
Sure,
they talk about it being challenging and highly sort of like, you know, tenuous and you know, really.
No, I agree. Electroacoustic music is awesome.
And as Xenakis, like it's thrilling. I mean, like I find it very unpredictable and sort of I think and feel things I wouldn't have felt otherwise, and I can say that I can say that about that sort of genre of music more easily than I can many others.
Man, do you remember that album? It's called Charles Dodge Magnetic Fields, and it's like just the Earth's magnetic field.
You've told me about it, sure.
That's a cool
What
one.
Genre is that?
Oh, I forget what they classify it as, but it's a sort of like field record, maybe data sonification.
Ah, yes.
It's something. That's an absurdly weird sort of musical experience.
It sounds brilliant, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, and I found the segment here. So this is Reynolds asking Marcus, didn't you once declare that you never found New York's version of punk the least bit interesting? For you, punk was what happened in the UK, and then a few of the bands in San Francisco, like the Avengers. But what about the Los Angeles scene? Did you rate the Germs and the Weirdos and the rest? Marcus's answer, I liked X. There were all kinds of people who made records I liked, such as The Descendants, but in some ways I was too much of a snob to appreciate how great the Avengers were right at the moment in 77 and 78. What appealed to me, what was shocking, what was overwhelming, was the way in which punk, as it was enacted in the UK, was a social revolution in the form of this tiny little medium that boiled down to a 7-inch piece of plastic. All the demands on society, on life, on ontology, on epistemology, all the critique of being, all that was boiled down into that little piece of plastic. All those demands are present in that noise, and in that vocal sound. I knew this was not just a new kind of music. This was not just a new sense of humour, or a new sense of irony. What I disliked about New York punk was irony. Reynolds asks, you don't think much of the Ramones, right? Marcus, no, fuck postmodernism. Give me modernism. Modernism says the world has to be changed and we're going to draw a picture of it, what it ought to look like. And then you've got Malevich, you've got Cubism, you've got Magritte. This is the way the world really looks. And what are you going to do now? That was what you could hear in the Sex Pistols and in so many other groups, whether it was X-Ray Specs or Laura Logic or Gang of Four or the Raincoats or the Clash in moments. In complete control, God knows. I heard that right away. This was something completely different. This was a critique of life, and the demands in this music were absolute. It was never going to be satisfied of anything. Music just happened to be the medium, and it was a better medium. The avant-garde of the 20th century had finally found its true voice. I think I wrote that punk produced better art than all the avant-garde movements before it, and I meant that. That wasn't a provocative statement. These were singular works of art, and they were coming in a torrent. For a time, anybody could stumble upon a true statement and make it. It didn't matter where they came from or who they were. I'm just jumping ahead here to another part of another answer. So that is this great moment of free speech. He's describing earlier the free speech movement as it occurred in America in the 60s on the college campuses, which some of you may know about. It's a fairly interesting area of knowledge. Anyway.
Yeah, plenty of books about it.
Oh, yeah. So that is this great moment of free speech, and punk rediscovered that. Not as any kind of historical reference, let's do it like they did. Not at all. But that is a human moment. That is a cultural moment. Part of the history of Western civilization, the whole notion of the individual, the whole notion of rights, and putting them into practice. One thing I learned about punk, it's never revived. It's rediscovered. And when it's rediscovered, it's like it never happened before. The best story of this kind was told to me by my friend Robin Sembalest, who I knew from Art Forum. She later wrote this up in a wonderful essay called Tradition, A Curse, Punk in a Small Spanish Town, in the Village Voice Rock and Roll Quarterly, summer 1988. She spent a year in a small town in Andalusia. These kids come up to her and say, "We're punkies, we have these Sex Pistols records, but we don't know what they mean. Could you translate them for us?" So she writes all the lyrics to the songs out in Spanish so they can hear what they say. This is 1983. Now I start singing the songs in Spanish on the street, but they also start hearing the songs in a way they never could before, full of the rage and the dynamics and exploding walls in the songs intact, with the slogans and the signposts too. They begin to delve into the history of their own town and discover forgotten anarchist traditions. They discover how the anarchist movement was repressed during the Spanish Civil War. They begin to realize that they are part of a historical continuum. There has been a conspiracy of silence to deprive them of knowledge of their own real legacy. And then they go off and live their lives with a sense of resentment and deprivation and anger that they didn't have before. That's the punk story. And that was not a revival, that was a rediscovery. And so it was with these articulate words from Marcus, which I really wanted to ground the idea that punk was sort of employing the sort of aesthetic revelations of sort of the visual art modernism into sonic form, which prior to had been present to some degree in sort of more 20th century classical music or electronic or electroacoustic music, to some extent in jazz certainly, but in popular music this was to some degree
very few,
mostly vacuously. I'm
maybe
afraid.
Like Pet Sounds,
Zappa, Beefheart probably is the argument to be made there.
Those two go into touches of non-pop music, though.
That's the thing.
Whereas the Beach Boys never go into the avant-garde, except for maybe Smiley Smile.
Yeah.
That's the closest they get. I would guess easily. But yeah, there's not many in, say, like the 50s or 60s, like pure pop genre that really sort of transcend in that sense. Outside of like pure commercialism as a sort of like modernist realization. For sure.
There was a certain pop art playfulness to some stuff in the mid 60s, like obviously Who Sell Out most clearly.
Yeah.
But I think there was a certain like pop art's relationship with the avant-garde is legitimate, though also fractured, given this disposition, right?
It couldn't exist without it. Yeah.
And without just sort of elevation of commercial iconography.
As a reaction to.
It sort of slowly eroded the existence of the avant-garde in the gallery context. We could argue. I think that was its lasting legacy. Although I think there was a certain shock sculpture quality to works going in the 70s onward, which I would argue that kind of went out of what we're in now is sort of just a more aging version of what existed in the late 80s and early 90s in terms of gallery art. But
I really don't know that much about it.
There's several documentaries you can watch that tell the story, basically.
Okay.
State of the Art from the late 80s, and then The Price of Everything from 2018, which is basically, if you want the bridge between then and now, there it is. Like, you know it like 85% if you watch those.
I guess at some point as well, installations became all the rage.
Yeah. That's almost a separate world. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, I'm sure installations are around in like in modernism for sure. They were.
Yeah, it's almost you can almost like it's less like because the reason it's different is like. Gallery art in the sense that because the installation is sort of like a little event that the gallery holds in a room, whereas the work is something that is priced off. Is sometimes there's sort of a price put on it at times. I would distinguish the two. It's just because there is that sort of formal distinction in those worlds between the things. Yeah. They are both in galleries, though. To be fair.
Yeah.
And they are both considered, I guess, prestigious. But no, but as something like this, it's like a more working class environment, sort of. Entry into the world of the more serious and convicted artistic avant-garde, and it's one of the better records on the punk world continuum dimension. I like it for similar reasons I like Milk from Cheltenham, but also that Kama Sutra record you brought up in Mandala.
Yeah.
It's almost like tearing at those two things.
Yeah, definitely.
But prior to both of them existing.
Yeah. And, one more thing about Poison Girls as well. You should check out the song that first got me into them was a song called Dirty Work. And in my mind, that's the 70s song called Dirty Work. I like the Steely Dan song.
Yeah, it's a good song.
But the definitive Dirty Work is Poison Girls. Like, I wonder what Fisher, if he ever heard it, would say. Because it's like the working class anthem. It's awesome.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, no, this is an excellent one. I was really, really happy to hear this one. It's good to have the punchy 30-minute sort of releases, just because I guess we can touch upon that idea more so with your next pick, because that's not a very long album either.
Nah, that's about the same length.
But yeah, so is that all? Because I think that's more or less everything I have to share about Poison Girls.
Yeah.
And via Marcus, I was sharing quite a lot, I suppose.
No, that was a good bitch, yeah.
Anyway, so shall I be moving on to my next pick here?
Yeah.
Okay, so the OCs, A Weird Exit. This group I first became familiar with of actually more recent work. They've got quite a few albums. They've been active since 1997, formed in San Francisco. And they have, how many albums? Like 28, 28 since 2006.
I've heard this band around, and I'm just like, where have I heard this name before? I've never heard their music until today, but for some reason I've just heard the name a bunch.
And what I first became familiar with the group was, I'm pretty sure, an album from I didn't hear it at the time, but sometime later I heard an album from 2019 called Face Stabber. It was really, really, really cool. And then later on in a 2023 album, which I would have heard, I think during last year, called Intercepted Message, I thought was quite good. And then an album from this year called Sorks 80, which is more of a synth punk experiment.
Okay.
Terrific. And I went back.
Yeah, that one had a cool cover.
Oh yeah, you've seen that one. It's nice. You looked at the profile, I assume.
Yeah, I just on their YouTube thing.
Yeah, and at some point after listening to that, like maybe a couple of months ago, I ended up looking for more of the stuff on YouTube. The one I ended up going toward, because it was quite well rated on RYM, is this album A Weird Exits. I think it is their most well rated. No, it's not quite, but it's one of them. And I checked out A Weird Exits, and it's like, yes, this is terrific. The two words came to my mind. These words, acid punk.
Yeah.
Like what I wanted, and it's funny they're from San Fran as well. It's like what I was thinking about when that Brian Jonestown Massacre 2019 release. It's like, yeah, I love this sort of like idea where you're embodying that sort of like slacker rock sort of like gigging world, but you have that sort of like acid ethos. You're not sort of like sort of snobbishly sort of, oh, that's hippie shit. Like you're just sort of like, there's this world needs no pretensions, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they're slagging off the prog people for being pretentious. There's no reason punk has to be either. And that's often what punk is accused of being from the prog / hippie crowd.
Yeah.
/ hard rock people.
Or as being like zealous or something, or like, sort of fundamentalist.
Yeah, and there's no reason it has to be. It doesn't have to be sort of like just goofily open-minded and just sort of like la-di-da either. But it can be critically minded, and also willing to have like a conversation and sort of like incorporate ideas within that sort of like fundamental sort of all-encompassing principle,
Yeah.
And then A Weird Exits by the OCs I thought was a really terrific distillation of what I was praising about. For example, that Jonestown 2019 album, and of a really sort of rich production, captivating songs, great 60s psych, 13th floor elevator-esque qualities, but also terrific instances of
Crayola.
The likable qualities of sort of more slacker-esque neo-psych bands from like the 90s onward.
Yeah.
And it's just one of these things where as much as I like that Brian Jonestown release, they're also one of those bands where like there's so much of Brian Jonestown Massacre, and when you do sample like some like stuff from the 21st century, it tends not to be like totally enticing, sadly.
Yeah.
And even like the stuff they put out after that album, one of them I thought was quite good, but then the one after that, which is more recent, I didn't think was particularly didn't move me so.
A bit hit and miss, I guess. Yeah.
Whereas, like, from what I see of this group, this is like a more modern sort of like determined sort of, you know, only been releasing music since 2006. So they're less from that because of boring like Gen X sort of.
They have less pop sensibilities as well. They're not trying to write pop songs as much. It's more in a sort of vein of like even krautrock a little bit of like all the things you mentioned obviously, but also like the first two songs I was like, man, this sounds like a 21st century like Pylon.
Ooh,
you know, that sort of like Georgia, like, you know, post-punk jangly sort of thing. But then it went off into like more sort of krautrocky noise territory and like a bunch of different sort of places. Acid punk's a good way to describe it because it reminded me a bit of that of the other San Francisco group, the Thinking Fellas Union.
Oh, cool.
It's a bit like that as well.
Yeah.
Like it's such a like these guys must be fans of all the best sort of like experimental punk music because it sort of did all those things, but even to like sort of places that those sort of albums could never have gone. With their production, like, you know, one of the tracks on here starts cutting out in such a way where I'm like, is my speaker doing that? I'm like, nah, it's definitely the music. And I'm just like, nah, maybe it's just like my phone, because it sometimes will like, you know, cut out and become all janky.
Uh-huh.
And I'm just like, nah, how did they do this? You know, cut it up in such a way. And as well, the last song in this album was like one of the best songs I've heard. Like, that's such a good song. It's just like a sort of like 6 minute long, like post-rocky, like folk ballad sort of epic. And I was like, man, this is a killer track. Yeah, this was a very good album. I'm keen to check out more of their stuff.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of it too.
Yeah,
and what I've heard of it was good.
For like a mostly like instrumental punk band, they really sort of have a commanding sort of approach to sound production, you know, to sort of splaying out all these sort of things, you know. And no song really sounds the same, you know. They all do a different thing.
Yeah.
That sort of captivated me. It's like a sort of like, the heart of it, I guess, is like a sort of like garage punk, but it just really goes beyond that. Like it goes like a few of the songs, like, they're just built out of like sort of chugging riffs, but then it just goes into so many places. I'm like, how did it get here? It's a very peculiar album in that sense. I was very captivated. For sure. It's like that first Love Tractor album fully realized.
Yeah, no, it's just cool that you can have like, because there is still a desire for bands of this sort of disposition, and I've kind of explained why that is prior, at least for myself, because we were like too young to really explore much of that world, I think, and also like that world sort of became a lot less interesting when in the Sydney, I guess it's sort of hit or miss, that world at any given time, you know. Like a lot of the pop rock stuff was never very good, and like, you know, you had to know where to find cool sort of bands, and like, you know, that sort of scene is very hit or miss, I think, in the Sydney dimension. I believe, from what I understand at least.
For sure.
And so, like, if you're in America, being able to catch, you know, if you're even something like, if you're in Texas or Oregon, obviously California, it goes without saying, but like, you know, being in like a fairly lucky part of a state or city, major city of a state, where you'll get like sort of alt bands touring, whether you're at like a local, it's a record shop or like a gigging center, there's a booker there who like knows the go. It just would have been such like a potent, fun, sort of like carefree, well, not carefree, but like, you know, idealistic bohemian lifestyle. And I like the idea of like that sort of being like a potent sort of lived in DIY tradition. And the OCs is a band that embodies that sort of want and dream with their music, but more importantly, they make it seem relevant and not like sort of retro and sort of like blindly sort of vacuously nostalgic in the context of the 2010s, because the production and the sort of they're more, as opposed to Brian Jonestown Massacre, which seemed more interested in that sort of like 90s, you know, fuck production, fuck the 80s, this is real songs world. These guys first started making music in 2006 rather than like the very early 90s. rather early 90s when Jonestown puts up, mid 90s and Jonestown puts out their stuff. But I feel like the OCs are more appreciation of big digital electronic landscapes as opposed to sort of, I know there was a shoegaze sort of wash over, or not just that 2019 Brian Jonestown album, but like the first one, and some others in there from what I understand, particularly when shoegaze was a thing. When shoegaze or shoegaze revival is a thing, they tend to like...
Fuzz alt rock.
Yeah. But it's still like that sort of slackery, strum-driven like sort of songwriting, whereas these guys are more interested in like everything under the sun within like an electronic or sort of psych rock pathology. And I think that makes them more open to creativity than Brian Jonestown Massacre, as it were, I guess. That sort of like songwriter sort of like, alt rock sort of, whatever.
They're like a punk or like a garage punky slacker band, but with like a sort of like a noisy edge, that the Massacre just don't really sort of have.
Yeah.
Like they got a... Yeah, sort of. Yeah, they must have a taste for like out there experimentally, like post rock sort of.
Yeah, they're almost like old krautrock records.
Yeah, I suspect. Definitely.
Like the fun, more bizarro psych rock of the '60s, not just sort of the British sort of like la-di-da Sid Barrett stuff, like rather, or Brian Jones obviously, but they're like 13th Floor or Red Crayola or just weirder stuff, Silver Apples maybe. Or the Pink Floyd after Sid Barrett leaves, when you get to Ummagumma and Saucerful, that sort of this is real experimental, like like let's create what does the creation of Galaxy sound like sort of music, what I mean?
The music they made when they realized they didn't have a pop songwriter
before they started trying to like hone them into like pop songs again, and sort of where does that begin? Like I guess Echo / Obscured by Clouds, and there's a couple tracks on Atom Heart Mother, but that's sort of, there's also like the sort of side long tracks on there too. Atom Heart Mother's quite brilliant. I think it's a touch underrated even. I mean, as underrated as a Pink Floyd album can be, I would imagine, I guess. But anyway, I guess that's all I have to say of much interest about for those listening. For a weird exits from the OC.
Another sort of experience album you can listen to and make your own opinion about, because if you're into this sort of out there punk music, it is quite good. Like if you never heard something like this before, it'll sort of maybe throw a wrench in the circuits, but maybe that's a good thing.
But it's not much over 40 minutes, is it?
No, it's probably about 40 minutes long.
Like it's a fairly regularly paced album. It doesn't indulge like a lot of the older albums. I mean, it's not alienating. Like it's music that, well, at least the people playing it for was very captivating, catching, and exciting. You know what I mean? It's not like they're just like waffling, like assuming it would sound good once they played it back. You know what I mean?
That's not
that sort of. You could throw that accusation toward certain groups if you really wanted to at times. Maybe.
Sure.
Potentially. And do you want to move on to yours next?
Yeah, let's get to my next one.
Here.
Hell yeah. We got Lord Shorty, Soca Explosion. I'm just going to quickly sort of, isolate any potential American viewers you have by quickly saying I'm in the Soca fever because, the cricket season's approaching, and although we're playing India this year and Australia, West Indies was last year, I just sort of felt I had to sort of get in the right spirits, and I suppose this album would definitely capture the cricket spirit, at least more so than like a 10cc knockoff or something.
Or Squeeze?
Squeeze, yeah, they all do it. UB40.
I don't know that one.
Yeah, this is a weird sort of... Soca's like a genre. I guess I came across like half a year ago and I was looking through types of like calypso music. I was like, what the hell is soca? And then this album came up and I saw that there was a song called, like, when I looked it up, there's like a little video for the song Shanty Home, and I'm like, man, this is awesome. And I guess soca's like it's a calypso reggae sort of mixed with like disco or something like that, you know. It's just got like the tropical sort of, rather than like the cliche sort of calypso sounds, you have it instead of like, you know, steel drums, you have things like synthesizers, like analog synths and like drum machines and disco beats and stuff like that. And it creates this strange sort of like party atmosphere. Like, it's very sort of like simple party music, but then it'll go off and have like sort of talking heads, like instrumental breaks and things like that, you know?
Yeah.
Just these sort of interesting little tidbits. And compared to some of the other sort of like calypso and soca records I've heard, this one has a very sort of like full production to it, you know. It's a lot of it is sort of like sparse, and that the sort of roughness is almost the sort of charm of it. But yeah, this one has a very full sound, especially for like, what, 78 or something?
Oh, it's coming out in 79, it says.
79, yeah. I guess this guy, he must have been one of the sort of bigger dance pop stars in like Trinidad or something. Because, yeah, I get the feeling that this must have been recorded at like the most top of the line studio. It's just got that sort of like fun dance wash about it. And there's something about the atmosphere of this album, and I don't know, I have a sort of fondness for, maybe it's just because of cricket and CLR James and things like that, of like of Trinidad and like the sort of the West Indies like collective as a general. There's an interesting quality about it that this album sort of evokes, I feel, where like I said, it's just party music, but the sort of sentiment to it is just sort of like, you know, what would you call it? It's universalism, but it's sort of like, it could only come out of a place like the West Indies, which is such a Creole culture, you know. It's like a sort of mongrel, like a amalgamation of British Empire, like migrational movements, you know. And that's why it's so like racially conscious in like a very positive sense. Like, there's this strange idea of like, because perhaps there was so much like racial tension between like Africans who were brought over, Indian immigrants, and like, you know, the white British ruling class, and Hispanic people who came over as well. Yeah, there's just such it's like the West Indies is like one of the first sort of foundations, or like sort of boiling pools of like this internationalist sort of like idea, right? And that sort of idea is just like teeming on this album. But it's done in like in the sort of party anthem sense that's so indicative of like trashy 2000s and 2010s like EDM and stuff. What was the Love Generation? What was that guy, like Bob Sinclair or something?
I don't think I remember.
Yeah, just music like that, you know, that sort of like really cheesy like house anthem stuff. Whereas this is like almost the punk rock equivalent of that in a way, you know, coming from the source, the culture, the sort of that internationalist place, and a sort of like, a humanism that sort of involves like a sort of celebration of people just being able to party together, you know. That's sort of as a first step to sort of mutual understanding. You're going to get there through partying in a way. It's a sort of utopian vision, at least for music. Music's good for envisioning like utopia just through partying, you know. And I just sort of, especially that Shanty Home song as well, that's a good indication of that sort of Creole thing I'm talking about, because it's like a calypso dance song, but he's singing an Indian prayer. You know?
Intriguing, yes.
Yeah, there's a strange sort of like, as well, there's like lyrics on the album about how like the monotheistic God or whatever is like no color, no culture, like it's just a part of everybody or whatever. It's like that sort of universal truism, but almost like, utopian music in a way.
He only has one album after Soca Explosion, Lord Shorty does, and it's in 1999, Jammu Victory, don't know much about it.
Nah.
He's credited as Raz Shorty first.
Because he's got a few albums before this one.
A few, none of them seem to be very well known or rated very much.
No, it's not a...
they're the one in 76 Sweet Music, is like 13.
There's probably not an album in this genre that's got more than 100 ratings, you know?
No, not at all. I mean, not on this discography anyway. It's very good and like it's just sort of bouncy, well produced. I mean, it is sort of its time, but in a very clearly likable way, I believe. And you know what it had me thinking of? Back, you said it's good thinking. I think it's useful you mentioned party music because that does lean into what I'm going to say here, I believe. And that's what LP. This is pre-internet, I mean, there's cassette tapes perhaps, but you have radio, but it doesn't may always play what you want. But pre-digital, you had to, and people wanted, nowadays, people were at a gathering and they say, I'll put some music on, and you go to like some Spotify playlist or you go to some YouTube, chill ambient music, mix, lo-fi, whatever, and you do that. And you don't really think about, like, you're not really interested in works of art. You're just like, oh, music, come here and entertain us. Like, they're like little nibbles, and you're like, it's like something on like a catering table. You know what I mean? Like, they don't give a stuff about the music. But what I kind of like about, I'm not trying to be too, like, sort of archaic and boomer-esque here, but like, what I like about the LP era is, like, people bought, like, a collection of LPs with, like, a very specific sort of, like, wider sort of multi-functional purpose in mind.
Sure.
Because they had like, okay, you buy these records and you knew that like, when you had gatherings and people wanted to put music on, like you had like, obviously there were records like, that like nowadays of like your silly greatest hits or like various artist compilations, it's all the hits and the 80s and blah, blah, blah. But there were albums that you could put on like that. Like apparently in the 50s there was the Marty Robbins, early 60s I think, sorry. The Marty Robbins album apparently was like that at one time. Everyone just had the Marty Robbins album and they'd play it and everyone liked all the songs on it. Rumours by Fleetwood Mac is like that for the 70s.
Man, how many 60s parties do you reckon had Herb Alpert playing?
Ah, yeah, exactly. See, that's kind of my point. Like, there were all these albums that people just put on because it was just perfect sort of beautiful background music and like it would just fulfill the function and like, they were just... That's what... You really... And I think... So these albums really became appreciated as like sort of devices and like tools to elevate the mood rather than just like some record of jazz people or like fusion people noodling for their own sake. Sure. That's all well and good. Some of that stuff's very nice and so it's really boring too, frankly.
Sure.
But, it's just one of those things where I liked that records had that function within the buying public, you know what I mean? And this would have been a perfect, like everyone, especially within the more cultural context of the West Indies, Trinidad and Tobago, wherever, or the diaspora elsewhere perhaps, really appreciating this sort of, and just like, it's just in the background. I remember I had a friend whose parents are from South America. I think one was from Colombia, the other was from Chile. And he said that like, he mentioned to me, there's some like compilation album. I don't know how old it is, but like he showed it to me on his iTunes. Like, hey, look, I've got this thing. And then he pointed to like some other like sort of guy whose parents were from Haiti or like descended from there, and or Haiti and some other country. Anyway, pointed to him and was like, hey, this album, eh? And he's like, oh yeah, that's everyone know that. They may have been family friends somewhat.
That's
as well.
Hilarious.
I was like, so I just love the idea that there's those sort of albums. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That might have been a various artists sort of thing. I could be wrong,
Sure.
or maybe I don't remember. This is like over 10 years ago now, actually. But no, it's just fascinating how like, especially in the LP era, you had no choice but to take the record seriously. You know what I mean? There was no other. You had to like, you put this on, and it's going to create this sort of environment. Whereas now it's like you have really no choice but to just pick sort of a catch-all sort of beige. Everyone can appreciate it sort of thing.
Yeah.
But see, I like the idea of putting on an album and seeing what it does to a room. I was at a gathering once, this is early 2016, and I put on... I put on just to see what would happen, just because I wanted to listen to it and see what would happen. I was at someone else's place, but I had all these albums on my laptop at the time, and I put on the new album, the first one, and there was like, girls like a year younger than me. Actually, I would have like put it off if like people were enjoying it, but they were dancing to it, so I was like, okay, cool.
Yeah.
And then someone else was having a fucking anxiety attack because they weren't being 101% catered to. They do this in every social situation from what other people would tell me. But like, I put on the Avalanches album hoping that would change things. Didn't, because they weren't being 101% catered to again. But like, the point is like, and people were enjoying the Avalanches album except for them, you know, whatever. But like,
I brought it up on the show.
Yeah, exactly. It's brilliant. But no, it's just one of those things where like, yeah, I was trying to like embody it. And it's interesting how like specific records will embody kind of a specific mood. Yeah. Because obviously if you're just changing song to song to song to song, it's just like nothing really, it's just sort of fluctuating, nothing really happens.
There's not a consistent mood. Whereas, something like this sticks to that sort of, party atmosphere.
Yeah, this is really good, very solid, sort of, again, like, it's great when these 30 to 40 minute records, it's like, this can't be 40 minutes, you know. It's a bit under that probably, I would imagine.
Yeah.
And they just like, they don't outstay their welcome, obviously. And they just, everything is sort of punchy and just engaging and consistent. And you know, like you wonder like, why do records need to be longer? I get it sometimes it's like, they lend themselves to being a bit longer and you do think like if this was shorter, this wouldn't be as effective. There are plenty of cases like that. But like, the idea that like,
this isn't a concept album or anything.
Well, that's a good point, yeah.
Like a double LP, sort of, you know.
But it has you thinking, like, how long, like, do you want to be listening to, like, any form of music? You know what I mean? If you were just listening to random instances of soca, you know, like some random compilation, and it went for, like, 2 hours, how long would you be listening to that? Probably, like, 35 to 40 minutes. And that's the beauty of something like this. It's not
unless
like,
you're partying.
I guess that's
because if you're dancing, you know.
Yeah, but wouldn't you like potentially think of like dancing to a different kind of music after a while?
Oh, well, that's why DJs come in and change it up for sure.
Yeah,
you're right. 2 hour sort of thing is. That's why the great experiments of like Lil B doing like 4 hour albums are awesome. They're almost like a statement on digital music or something like that.
Yeah, like it's just like with stuff like that, it's like it's almost like he challenges you to like, you know, just take it seriously as one specific experience, even though like you do get the impression that these are just a series of tracks he's just placed in a list, and it's not the order is not meant to be.
It's less that you're actually meant to do it in like at different times, not at all at once, if you know what I mean. It's the opposite of that old album format of like, say, a double album you're meant to listen to.
Oh, you think that's what's being inferred?
Yeah, it's more like you're meant to just listen to it as like the months go, you know.
Okay, I was wondering maybe if he mentioned that somewhere.
Nah, I don't think there's anything about it being like...
I'm not an in-depth fan of the guy. I admire his work, but I'm not... He's such a huge body of work for it, or like his interviews or whatever, or anything like that.
Yeah.
I'm not like... I'm not sort of...
I saw him interviewed on like ESPN. He was in a dress. It was hilarious.
I'm not sort of particularly... I guess active when it comes to like tracking down interviews of the artists I admire.
Yeah,
and it reminds me of something. This is not
sometimes, but in a similar way to like where you would like find a citation earlier or like came across something interesting with that.
With Marcus. Well, I was going to bring up Marcus because he said that like he got to a point where he tried to like avoid even interviewing artists because he preferred like what the song. He said, I don't really care or like what the artist like the song means to them. Like I'm more interested in what it is, and I think that's an interesting perspective. Like that's
not an interesting angle of like questioning though, to ask an artist what the song's about, because if they communicated it well, it would sort of be self-evident. I think a better sort of line of questioning is like just what is the your constructive process, you know, how did you form that, rather than what does it mean,
right?
You know, hopefully to the artist what it means is self-evident, right?
Yeah, but it's like I never really tracked down the interviews that enthusiastically or sort of you know, really in a rush, you know, because just there was something. I guess it's because a part of me is just I don't really know what I'm going to learn. Like even like with filmmakers, like I almost try to avoid it to some degree because it's like I get concerned about like if I read too much about what one person did, like I would want to like I guess if I was making films, like, you know, try to emulate that or like try to copy that a bit too much. I'm just sort of like I guess I want to more see individual films and sort of like potentially sort of like, you know, if I feel like it's sort of like, if I'm getting something, you know, if something's resonating with me and I would like it to, or think it could positively impact my own ideas, then I'll sort of try to think about it in terms of like, you know, what's going on. And maybe I would like look into more what's going on from what the artist had said, the author, director had said. But yeah, with music, because I don't have that relation even like with, you know, composing my own music at all really, but it's sometimes it's like, and also like I kind of wait for the music to kind of really get to me. I guess I'm a bit more charitable with films because I, you know, put films together, so I, you know, take it seriously. I you know, have an intrinsic appreciation of it. But with music, it's like, well, there's so much of music, and it's just like, I kind of like want it to sort of like arrest me first, you know, like I almost don't have the time to like, just like, oh, but this is a really competent example of this. It's like, that's great, but like I just don't care that much. Like I don't know what else to say.
No, I agree. In my next pick, I'll get to that sentiment for sure.
Oh, sure, yeah, and it's just it's one of these things where, like it's, I don't know, like I often I often consider that like if. Yeah, I guess the point I'm trying to make is like like sometimes it is we are better off if like, and it's not like trying to say that like you know, the sort of like, I'm not trying to like put down the idea of like the CD or like, I don't like that cliche where there's like too many songs and there's like, oh, it's like you gotta like, they cut the fat and like, you know, like, it just seems like such a superficial way of describing records.
Like, I always forget how long my last pick was. I always forget that album is that long. We'll get to it later, obviously. Yeah. But like, it's so entrancing that I forget how long it is. Sometimes the CD era, it does help because you're not changing the vinyl, so you just, it's a continuous experience, you know.
So like, yeah, they may as well like sort of boil down the runtime to like the really arresting sort of like, you know, addressing your motivation for like putting a needle down in the first place, or pressing play in the first place. Yeah, that's what I've got to share.
Well, especially in a place like the West Indies around this time, they were so conscious of like turntable, like, you know, DJ deck.
Oh yes, true.
Audio culture. They invented it, you know. It's sort of the Jamaican contribution to music in a way. Even though this is Trinidadian, but you know, they're the same cricket team at least.
Okay.
We're culturally distinct. Like I said earlier, it's a very, 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 very sort of mixed area. But yeah, like, I do agree with that sentiment. Something like this, definitely, it helps being like 33 minutes long. It's just like punchy, you know? Or similar to Hex, I guess, as well. Yeah. As opposed to, what's your next one?
Oh, what we're going with here is
that's...
Theory,
nice.
Pol. My Polish pronunciation is not going to be ideal.
Yeah, Polish is hard to pronounce.
And it's Lona I. Weber. Now that's just two individuals, Lona and Weber, two, I guess, hip-hop artists from Poland. I wouldn't have thought Polish hip-hop was a thing, but here we are. And now, I guess why I came across, I saw this in one of the charts of the 2010s one day. It was over for, I think it was for 2011 itself, perhaps. It may have been, because it's in the top 100 of 2011, so maybe that's where I saw it initially.
Okay.
Because, you know, and... you know, just it's not the kind of thing I would come across on YouTube as such.
No.
Anyway, and the cover like kind of was intriguing, and
it's like Bauhaus Staircase.
Yeah, and I realized that I know this Loner guy because he had an album from last year called Taxi, which is very well received. So I was like, oh yeah, I guess I know of him.
Okay.
And so I went and listened to this out of curiosity, because I knew in the near future that I'd sort of be looking into these 2010s albums for one future show, and I found myself pretty excited as to thinking right away when I'm listening to it, yeah, I think I would like to discuss this right before the album was finished even. And the reason is because one, it was already, you know, very good, consistent, sort of entertaining, engaging standard, but also because I was like, so they've sort of like extracted the sort of like sort of vaguely moldy, maybe by the 2000s, like sort of 70s, 80s sort of R&B funk stylings, and now it's like all like sort of purely electronic, like almost like 70s library music, sort of downward-esque, like they don't sound like samples from like James Brown tracks or Zeppelin in a couple of cases. It's just pure like Bernard Feather or like modern, just sleek electronic stylings, with the hip hop, the rapping, the MCing going over it, and the language I don't understand any of it. But like Simba LaRue's Tunnel from earlier this year, you really start to appreciate sort of the both melodic / rhythmic qualities of MCing for its own sake. And just like this really, being able to appreciate this is sort of like, from my perspective, sort of out there or avant-garde experimental hip-hop, even though it's not necessarily, it's just because the language is such a peculiar, like I've never listened to Polish hip-hop before.
You know how I'd describe their flows? It's like like we were talking about earlier, the Tribe Called Quest comeback album, where they take that old flow and like put a bit of a 2010s infliction on it.
Yeah, they do.
They sort of mix that 90s like backpacker thing with a sort of newer flow, like a more sort of a verbally dense sort of flow, right?
Yeah.
But then all the melodic like choruses are straight out of like the early 2000s, like sort of crunky stuff. Like there's a type of hip hop based in San Francisco from that time. I think it's called like hi-fi or something. And it's like the sort of choruses are that melodic and they sound like cartoony and like it sort of draws from that as well. I thought that was kind of neat.
That's interesting. Wow.
Which, especially like being in Polish, it sort of helps. Whereas when those choruses are in English, it's a bit clunky. Whereas I don't know, something about not being able to sort of understand the lyrics does actually help it as a sort of like instrumental rhythmic sort of piece, right? Yeah, this album's pretty great. Especially since like you mentioned, the sampling is very, very on point. Like on the first track, there's just this loop of a sample from Ego Trip in Part 2 by De La Soul, and sort of the second that was a loop sample. I was like, okay, this is sort of the well they're pulling from. And I thought it was neat because it's sort of like a fully, like similar to your first pick in regards to New Romanticism. I was like, so, especially like the sort of mid-tempo tracks. It was sort of like a fully realized version of that patchwork, like R&B, disco, boom bap sort of hip hop that started with that EPMD first album.
Oh yeah.
And it's like properly realized, like in a sort of full way, a full digital way. I thought that was really cool. Yeah, this album is sort of solid all the way through, and not a naff track,
Yeah, it's really, really cool, and like I wondered like this is an interesting little style, and I wonder where else it seems to operate, because there are things which could be considered vaguely similar, like obviously I mentioned Simba LaRue, but that sounds like more like 90s sort of UK or like continental European sort of like trip hoppy sounds in like a more hip hop context, and so that is like densely electronic in a way, and obviously some of the Lovely Main stuff from the mid 2010s on say Oblivion Access like is like very densely electronic. Or Vince Staples' Big Fish is very 90s in that sort of boom boom sort of whooshy sort of way, but here the sort of precision and the sort of like starkness of some of the sounds and the sonics makes me think of like cold European or UK library music of like the 70s,
interesting,
and like Telex and those sort of groups
with a bit of like
what Bellberry Polly were doing in the 2000s to homage that era,
and a little bit of, like you said as well, R&B, like that sort of, especially that like early 80s R&B that sort of hip hop would draw from, like that Matume song.
Oh Juicy, of course.
The drums and stuff from that, they can fully like pull that sound out.
Yeah,
this is definitely a sick one.
And I guess when I compare it to those sort of record, not that they sound like they're from like analog synthesizers or anything, but more just that like the sort of like precise, just sort of in and out clarity of all of the sounds, you know what I mean? They don't linger in the way that like the residual of like the old like electric bass, you know what I mean? Like, just like, right, it's all synthesized and sort of, a lot of it feels very, they're stark and like straight lines, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there's a little, it's no wonder they chose the art that they had, you know what I mean, for the record of the precise sort of Bauhaus architecture. It embodies Bauhaus architecture more than the sound of Bauhaus the band did at times, we could argue, though not their visual sort of schema. Anyway, no, I guess what was fascinating about this, I just was like, this is a unique little exercise in the hip hop continuum, and I just don't know if I've heard much like it in terms of the production, and I would find it fascinating. Like, it just got me thinking, like, hip hop from the context of like purely densely European electronic sounds of like the sort of mid 70s to early 80s period, you know what I mean? Like, you think of, Bernard Fever or to OMD or Telex, you know what I mean? Just like
sure.
That using that within like a hip hop framework would be quite interesting, I think. Just like a purely electronic sounds in general, rather than like kind of divorcing the R, because a lot of that stuff was divorcing the soul, you know what I mean, and the funk in the context of disco as it was. So what if you did that with and I listed some 2010 stuff, which kind of was like Vince Staples, arguably, on that A Big Fish Fury release, likely made on the 2015 Living Access. But yeah, I'd be interested to see that direction explored more so. Maybe there are things like, I guess some of the cloud rap's almost doing that, like Sweatshirt, mentioned that earlier.
Sure.
But yeah, no, I really appreciate what this was going for and what it executed. Yeah, terrific stuff, I feel, anyway. And I don't have much else to share about this one, I believe. Like, it's just something I was like, oh, I didn't see. I mean, it seems like fairly well rated and somewhat popular, but not enough so that I was like, I probably want to bring this up here, sort of like solidified in my memory as well,
Yeah.
It's easier than just bookmarking it on YouTube. It's so easier, or, in my browsers. It's better to do it on Mandala. I remember it.
And similar to Soca Explosion, this would be a good party album as well. Yeah,
if people were willing to deal with like the Polish lyric, I guess maybe they would. They'd just be like, "Fuck yeah, it's just rhythmic and just like you bop your head to it." It's good stuff.
You don't need to keep track of the lyrics at a party.
Point, yeah. Maybe they wouldn't even notice it's not in English. That would be fascinating.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm going to move on to the next pick now.
Yeah, let's do my next one.
Yes.
Got Nap Eyes, The Neon Gate.
Yeah, it's an odd name here, I must say.
Yeah, bit of a naff name. But this is a strange one. It's only released like about 2 or so weeks ago, I think, maybe like last month. But I came across it just out of sort of randomness again. I guess I want to thank the show for this sort of like idea of like reciprocity, right? Where you put like a sort of few things out there and then they come back at you in a weird way. Like I recently talked about that Modest Mouse album and like Wolf Parade and like T-Rex, and then somehow I just woke up like on a Saturday morning and got a random recommendation of a video from like this band's record label of like one of the tracks. I was like, oh, that album cover looks interesting. So I chucked it on and I was like, man, this is pretty good. And then like the next day I just listened to the album. I'm like, oh, I better check out this whole album. And I was like, man, this is good. And then like the next day I listened to it again. And then like within a week I listened to it maybe like 5 or 6 times. And it just kept drawing me back. There was something sort of like enigmatic and sort of like mystery box about it, I felt. And and sure enough, like pretty early on, I think it was because like one of the latest songs on the album, it kept mentioning like a couple times like vengeance for the murders of someone called Jacques Mallet. And I was like, what's that? Like at first I thought that he was singing like about Jean-Benet Ramsey, that weird like girl who went missing in like Haiti or something. I'm like, that's a weird lyric. But then I look up Jacques Mallet, and it turns out he was like the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar after like the Last Crusade, and like was killed by the French like the French crown in like collusion with like Rome and the Pope for some reason.
Oh, okay.
And then the Pope had to like it's this strange like 13th century politics, and I was just like, man, I just find it so interesting that like I was sort of cynical of indie rock, where I like similar to I never thought that. Like, especially after the 2010s, like, we've brought it up a bunch, it was just all this sort of, like, crappy indie rock, right?
Yeah, it was. Really, really was.
Whereas I was just like, man, another band's gone back to that sort of... Just that moment where, like, I don't know, there's just something about this album where none of the songs are, like, pop songs. They're all, like, it's more like progressive pop, where there aren't, like, any hooks or... It sort of reminded me of, like, a less dance poppy version of that Magdalena Bay album from this year, you know? Sort of in a similar sort of realm, like a sort of neo-psychedelic, like modern pop sort of thing. And, yeah, there's just a strange, like, sort of, once again, similar to that Modest Mouse, Moon and Antarctica album, there's, like, a strange mysticism that just, like, permeates throughout all these songs, like, incredibly, like, verbose songwriting that somehow, like, I'm just sort of a sucker for like, songs that are, like, cosmological or about how, like, for example, the opening track is about, like, starlings that can, like, feel gravity just through a sort of sensory experience that people don't have. And I'm just like, man, what an interesting idea for a song. So that's what I sort of mean by mystery box. Like, at first this album just sort of sounds pleasant, but then I was sort of just drawn in by, like, once again, the sort of verbose psychedelia of it, you know? And whenever something has that, like, enigmatic verbose psychedelia... Like, it's just sort of a cue for me to, like, follow and see what it has to say. And on the other end, I found this album had a lot of strange and interesting things to say, especially, like, that strange, like, 13th century sort of, like, medieval political, like, perspective on the world, mixed with, like, quantum theory and stuff like that. It's such an interesting sort of sonic space for, like, folky, psychedelic art pop songs. And, yeah, I was just sort of quite happy that I felt talking on this show about a few albums I liked, the world was able somehow to enigmatically reflect it back at me, you know? I really appreciate that. It's like an aspect of music I really do like, because I feel it's like completely uncynical, where, you know, in sort of, especially in places like the internet, you know, people are so like hive-minded where they have to like sort of go to the thing that everyone's doing or share opinions and things like that. Yeah. And they like have a sort of, like, I feel when you engage with that sort of feedback loop of like digital sort of logos, you know, if you do it with a certain earnestness, the things that really reflect yourself come back at you, you know, in a sort of proper way. And so I was like, man, I'm glad that music like this is still being made, for sure. Anyway, what do you reckon?
Oh, you know, I think, yeah, I've only listened to it the one time today, and it reflected actually what you described as like your kind of first experience listening to the album all the way through, and it was like sort of like, oh, this is pleasing, sort of like light, like psychedelic, sort of some acoustic, but some like sort of drony, like sort of, you know, that weird like psych/country sort of, I guess, is it feeding that the 13th floor elevators are from Texas, because a lot of those twangy psych sounds, which seem to stem from groups like them, they have that sort of vaguely country tinge to them, where, you know, they're
definitely, yeah.
And there's this group from Canada, actually.
I think they're from like Nova Scotia or something.
Yes, yeah, Halifax. Are you familiar with their other work, out of curiosity? There's like 4 albums before this.
Nah, I'd never heard of them.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, okay. So I was curious. But no, yeah, it's very pleasing and quite likable. I did have a very positive assessment of it. No, it's fascinating how it's on the dreamier side of like psych music. It's not like acid rock or anything like that.
No.
It's not like the dense sort of like in your face, you know, trippy sobriety of Animal Collective, or it's not the you know, what we were saying about the OCs before, which is sort of denser and more like maybe a bit challenging to the common listener.
Yeah.
Neon K. This is actually, it's like shoegaze without the sort of alienation potentially even.
Yeah.
You can hear the lyrics more so. But see, I haven't had the experience.
It's sort of like progressive
lyrics,
pop, you know, because it just...
Okay, yeah.
The songs don't have choruses, just like they have a linear construction, you know, where they just sort of like melt away, you know.
Shoegaze songs don't tend to have choruses, do they?
It depends.
Yeah, I guess so. Group to group.
Yeah.
I don't remember many choruses in My Bloody Valentine. I guess there are some
musical... they do have some choruses.
Yeah.
And for sure musical hooks.
Mm. But no, it's a fascinating little thing. Again, I said I quite enjoyed it. It's again, I don't have the, as I was saying, I don't have the experience of like learning about its persona lyrically as of yet, as you were sort of mentioning.
No, even I found out like after the third time I listened to it, that song with the Jacques Millet guy, apparently also the lyrics are like a Yeats poem.
Okay.
And I was like, man, how did this guy turn a Yeats poem into like fit it into the musical framework? You know? Fucking maniac.
Yeah. But no, quite a good release from 2024 here, as I think is something, it's something I want to do on the show regularly, is put forth strong new releases for people to sort of gaze at, listen to, wonder if they're just simple regurgitations of the past, or whether they're sort of exciting portals into the world henceforth. Who knows? But no, I do think this is quite a strong piece here. I don't have much to share about it other than having listened to it less than 6 hours ago, frankly. This is pretty good. I'm very happy to have heard it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Nice. Yeah, I don't know. I like the idea that like I mentioned with the Satellite Lovers album, people sort of like have a strange they jerk off the sort of divinity of the algorithm in cases like YouTube recommending.
They do. It's
music and
it's
stuff.
nauseating when they do, I believe. Yeah.
And I think there's a sort of interesting dichotomy there where on some degree when something like Satellite Lovers comes along, which is just sort of forces its way onto everyone's view, there's a sort of macro aspect of it where you're just sort of getting an observation into the wider zeitgeist. But then the sort of things where I feel at least individually you can engage with people in a very real way, and you sort of get a more particular feedback is when you get those strange sort of recommendations that probably you're the only one who's gotten. I remember recently I would have showed you, there's just some guy's channel who he just would sing the Iliad.
Yeah, that's terrific.
And then he has he's been making music on there since for 18 years or something apparently.
Yeah, wow.
And he's just got all these songs where they're just numbers, and it's just it starts off with 1-1 and then goes up to 1-100 and then it's 2-1 and then goes up to 2-100 and he's up to 50 now. I'm like, man, this guy must have he just keeps making music. There are all these just outsider artists out there like this,
Yeah. And
I just love that in a more direct way than ever, you can sort of get involved with these people.
Yes.
Across the world, And it's outside of that sort of... The reason why I think most people don't bother with it is because it's outside of the sort of, crowd mindset of, say, a website like Rate Your Music.
Yeah.
Or any of these websites are all based upon, mass social engagement.
Yeah, a fandom.
Whereas this is
where you appreciate the artist through this odd prism.
Whereas this is, sort of utilizing these tools in a more individualistic sense. That in my mind is fairly benign and sort of interesting at least. That's the most sort of fulfillment I've got out of using these sort of online tools, is from these sort of obscure corners that are not for everybody. They're, in a weird way, they just cater to whoever comes across them,
Yeah.
Whereas, in the case of Magdalena Bay, I saw recently they have a new single release, I think today, featuring Grimes, and I'm like, it's over.
Maybe, yeah.
Damn.
Yeah, I'm the kind of person where I can't. When people release new singles, I really can't be bothered going out of my way to listen to them. I don't know, I don't know what. Maybe I ought to do that more so, but I'm the kind of person where my motivation is
Mike had a new single and it's actually sick.
Oh,
it's
awesome.
only 2 minutes long.
You've played me some Maruja singles, which are
yeah, they're good. Yeah.
But I know those are not going to be like anyone else's singles. So
it's a bit more boutique or something. Sure.
Kind of sort of seductive, I suppose.
Yeah.
To play, but sometimes it's like with an album, it's like, okay, so I got like 40 something minutes of potentially good music with like got a good production watched the whole way through. Like I want to sooner want to check that out. It's like if they dropped a new album, I might be like, okay, I'll check it out. Anyone, you know, Death Dynamic Shroud especially, and there's plenty of them, right? You know, but if it's like, oh, they just released a song, it's like, oh, I'm sure it's good, you know, but like the album's, oh, it's gonna be like 40 minutes of like my time, you know, it's gonna be good, you know what I mean? It's like I've got something to do, and potentially like it's something I'm going to be spending a lot of time with, you know what I mean? Like even Poison Girls, I'll probably play Poison Girls a couple more times over the next couple of weeks, I suspect.
Nice.
It's really tremendous. Listen.
It's a good one for sure. Yeah, I haven't heard like you asked any of their other stuff, but I did apparently like their earlier stuff sounds a bit like, there's a song on here called Ice Cream Underpass, I think. And it's like a sort of fuzzier bit, and apparently they're a bit more like that, like a sort of Pavement earlier on. Though I did read apparently they had a song called Dark Link on the previous album, and I was like, what? And it's like a psychedelic folk song about the Ocarina of Time, and I'm like, man, this is hilarious.
Dark Link, yeah, that character, right?
Yeah, it's about like the water temple, or at least, and then like I was just like sort of listening to it in the background, and then I didn't really take note until he's just like, when I was in the forest temple, Ganondorf was there, but he was like, he wasn't real, he was like a false projection. And I'm like, man, this is like a video game I played as a kid. I can't believe there's a folk song about it now. I thought that was kind of neat.
Yeah, to be here with Mike Kozlak writing songs about
yeah, that's true. Like about like his latest album, he mentions the fucking song remains the same again. He loves that movie.
Right.
It's hilarious.
Album named after some movie, heroic dog, you know.
And there's just a random lyric where it's like, I love Budapest. It's like the houses of holy in here. And I'm like, what? Who the hell? He just wants to reference Led Zeppelin albums.
Oh, interesting. No.
But yeah, it doesn't seem like this album is really getting the... I don't know. It should be a little more well known, especially because apparently the previous album was a bit bigger. It's seemingly, whereas, this one just seems to have been like a quiet release. You know, just maybe recorded over, I think, through like the quarantine years or whatever.
Oh really? So this is early recordings.
Oh,
because this the one before that's from 2020. Yeah, I see.
Yeah, or at least I noticed they released like most of the songs except for I think
March
2020
2020 at that, so you know that's when the
so. No, all these are like released this year, but like they were released separately on like EPs seemingly.
Oh.
Except for 2 of the songs, and like all the EPs are like the album cover. There was like 4 of the EPs, and so there's like 4 pictures, and so the album cover is like an amalgamation of that. And I find that interesting because it seems like a sort of an album piece flowing through as one, like it was conceptualized as that.
Just looking here, it seems like singles rather than EPs.
Or I guess singles, you know.
But yeah, singles like, can have multiple songs on them.
Yeah, these days you call a digital single release with 4 songs a single rather than an EP, if you know what I mean. EPs are sort of outdated format, unless you release it physically.
Yeah, at least one of these singles had like 4 tracks on them.
Yeah.
Not all of them have track listings, or one of them doesn't. Anyway, maybe I'll move on now to my next pick here, which is the artist fucking Werewolf Asso, and the album is called Why Do You Love Me, Satan? It's a group was formed in 2008, disbanded in 2020. This would be the only full-length album they ever put out. There's some EPs, but it seems as though they didn't feel as though they had much else to say in their in their time together.
Yeah, well, Fucked Up released like 4 albums too many, so...
But what we've got here is like, you often have heard about it in places like Sea of Tranquility, like, you know, like how Sweden's a place where, you know, where they have like the rock sort of fandom, their rock and metal community, they're like really obsessed with like sort of the English language sort of canon and like all those like sort of rock bands in Britain and America, and they like idolize them. Like think about how the Swedish bands think like Iron Maiden, this like British group, are like the greatest thing in the world.
Sure.
You know, or like Venom, you know what I mean? Another British band. But it's interesting how much they lionize that sort of world. And what's interesting is fucking Werewolf Asso, it sounds like they're doing that, but with like a more like Hawkwind / like, I don't know, like stoner punk like take on that sort of like idolization of the canon sort of, but it's more of a counter canon they're sort of idolizing, which is interesting compared to like other like people who say like on those channels or see Tranquility at all like, oh, the great hard rock bands now coming from Sweden, because they're like just full homaging those sort of older groups like Maiden was even Zeppelin, but they're more of a they do it more sort of like, you know, with inclination to people like solos and like sort of like precision with like in rockist sort of trappings, you know what I mean?
Sure.
But this feels like it's more in that like...
This is definitely a punk crossover.
Yeah, this is more like, I don't know, like bits of Husker Du, bits of like weirdo stuff would classify as acid punk, synth punk even maybe.
Yeah, a little bit of death rock.
Yeah, death rock's a good
the
one.
synths and drum machine sort of stuff.
No, it's just like a thoroughly interesting, intriguing release, which I picked up because of the album art and also like 2010s, noting it was in 2014 in particular, again the year I turned 18, graduated high school, and it's one of these things where like, this would have been a band if I'd heard it at the time. I would have been like, hey, this is really cool, like I want to hear more from it. Shame I didn't hear it at the time, and that there was never anything more. I never got the disappointment of never hearing anything more, I suppose. But no, it just makes me think of like, yeah, there was like kind of cool, like nifty, sort of exciting stuff out there. There's stuff that made you want to be a sort of a loyal fan of it, you know, and kind of like, you know, like loudly proclaim yourself like, oh, this is the band, you know. You know, that you sort of in a sort of cliche way, but it seems like a really appealing prospect. And like if I had come across something like this, I might have felt more inclined toward it. Maybe like if I'd have found I found them a bit later, and I did feel very positively about it. But I believe that album by the interesting group, I mentioned like Devo wannabes, but in the nicest way possible. What are they called? The Coneheads. Before.
Yeah.
The Egg Punk's Whole World. And I believe
the Egg Punk's Whole World.
Sort of, that 2015 thing, LP number 1, 14-year-old high school PC fascist typology, whatever, you know, very long title. If I'd heard that in 2015, I'd be like, this isn't it. That's when I really got into Devo, was 2015. I guess that the whole world did too somehow. I wasn't alone.
Yeah, Egg Punk really took off then, yeah.
Yeah, I guess it was interesting. I didn't really know about Egg Punk till like 4 years later. I heard this on YouTube, I was like, oh my god.
It's Devo.
I think I found it on Soulseek. Anyway, the point is, yeah, it's just a really exciting, fun little thing that, like, it just, you know, it's in the top 100 for 2014. Probably how I found it. So like, it has like some degree of like popularity toward it. But I guess it's one of those things where like I wanted to, you know, solidify it in my memory as I claimed with the previous Lona I. Weber release, and yeah, just sort of put this out here, sort of champion it and say like, yeah, this is a sort of band that I would have been like all about had I been in on in the moment. And it's nice that obviously there are bands I can be in on in the moment now, whether it's Omni, whether it's Spaced, whether it's his collective, even something very mainstream like Magdalena Bay, or some very like sort of potentially alienating electronic / ambient / drone magician like Atom East. Or I guess I was gonna say Brian Jonestown, but some of that stuff in there, there's some fights and you know, it's just sort of groups I'd be championing right now. Ski Mask, I mentioned Cymbalaroo earlier, and speaking of Spain and punks earlier, the fantastic Viva Belgrado from Spain, terrific stuff. We talked about that on Mandala previously. And even as far as like metal goes, like I remember like how exciting that I want to hear another album from the act Absent Body. Put out Plague God in 2022. I'd very much eat another one of those up. And I got to explore Audrey a lot more. This million Audrey album it seems. That seems exciting.
It's the never-ending Audrey.
Yeah, what a wonderful world. I mean, in spite of everything else. But like, you know, Why Do You Love Me, Satan? Fucking Whale Faso. Yeah, I thought it was pretty terrific. I mean, it's not like a revelation, but in terms of just like, I like these genre movies that come out now, like that movie 65. I've talked about this on the channel, where it's just like a beautiful, like, it's nothing original, but it's a beautiful, like, gorgeous realization of like those mid 20th century dinosaur movies, better than pretty much all of them, maybe. Yeah, I guess certainly technically, but also better than all the Jurassic Park sequels, inexplicably.
Definitely better than.
I mean, yeah, you could say, oh, it's not as good as the original Jurassic Park. Yeah, that's a Spielberg. It's a really strong film.
And the second has its moments.
I actually agree. Yeah.
I'm just seeing seen the second way more than 65. I've seen it the once, but the one time I saw it, I thought it was really good. So.
Yeah, there are other examples of those sort of genre films, but yeah. So I'm talking a bit. Do you want to go on this album for a bit? Sorry.
Yeah, well, the genre sort of comparison's an interesting one because this is sort of like it's not necessarily like a sort of hyper original style or anything, but it's just like a very well realized take on that sort of like hardcore garage punk, like crossover metal, thrashy sort of. But this stuff is like in this case the best when like they sort of add psychedelic touches to it through just like the overdrive is just in like hyper mode or something, and it really they take aspects of abrasive production that literally weren't possible the first time round. So when you get shit like this, you realize it's actually more like heavier than like Slayer could ever have dreamed of being, or like Pantera, or like whoever would say are the like heaviest metal bands or whatever. They're not like extreme metal, right?
Yeah,
because that's a bit of a scapegoat, sort of like a trick to get out of it. Because I can say Napalm Death is the heaviest band ever.
Yeah,
that's missing.
I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Whereas something like this, it's just like I said earlier, it reminded me of like that band Fucked Up, if you remember them. It's a sort of like strange, garage hardcore. It's just like psychedelic tinges, and it's just like it's almost like what I wish like Motorhead was in a way.
Oh yeah.
Motorhead is very of its time, but like I guess it's a way that like 21st century metal and punk can actually really be way better than it ever was. As far as like committing it to wax, you can really get like that's the thing that lets down things like the first Black Flag album. Is just the limitations of its time. In a way, the only band in that SST realm that could really like utilize the limitations of their time and their budgets was the Minutemen, infamously, right? They jammed a Kona and they could do it, but most of them like couldn't really, and the albums were a letdown because of that. Whereas you get like these 21st century punk bands where it's not a pretension of them that to have it be like a sort of raw production, right? You want maybe that is the punk metal distinction as well, though. But yeah, so something like this is just the best of like 15 worlds,
Yeah, nice.
It was a good album. I liked it fucking quite a lot.
Yeah.
Most of these are all good picks, actually.
Oh yeah, I was sweet. Yeah, I guess appreciate that. Very nice stuff here. I guess that there's not much else I have to really significantly share about this. Oh, actually, no, I did want to say I was looking so when I was mentioning like recent sort of simple like sort of 20th like post-war 20th century style genre films, but realising the more digital context are really strong. I've talked about these in the channel before, so you can go check them out, everyone, if you'd like to see some screen caps, for example, on some of these. The two Lovecraft adaptations from 2020, one is the Deep Ones from Chad Ferrin, and also the Castle Freak remake. The original was Stuart Gordon's from 1995. Not as strong as that original, but that's Stuart Gordon. He's a pretty brilliant guy. But that remake was directed by someone named Tate Steinsiek. I'm not pronouncing that correctly, I believe, but I don't think I am anyway. And even as far as like those are some more lower budgeted films, but as far as like larger budget stuff, like Adam Wingard's a very talented director in any instance. Like Pop Skull from 2007 has been a huge influence on me as a prospective filmmaker, director, or whatever. But his take on the Godzilla versus Kong, how symmetrical and beautiful that is just magnificent. That's higher budget, and also higher budget, but like the best both Predator and Alien films in years within this decade. Yeah, I really appreciated Alien Romulus, but Prey in particular I thought was
that's an interesting comparison. Think about like 70s Godzilla versus Kong.
Early 60s.
60s, sorry.
Pedantic, I'm sorry.
Well, 60s, sorry, because the 70s Kong is the Twin Towers movie.
Of course, yeah.
But 60s Godzilla Kong is a bit like Damaged versus something like this,
Yeah.
It's sort of, I can see the dichotomy there, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, like, again, in those cases, it's like a high-budgeted film, but it's like, it's intense, it's so, like immediately, like, they're so, like, 60s, it's so, like, Ishiro Honda, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's a bit like more so than any of the giant monster attempts from like Hollywood, whether it's Michael Bay or even Guillermo del Toro, sadly.
Well, you brought up Jurassic Park earlier, the new Jurassic Park movie.
Yeah, what's with those?
Those
Why are those so crummy? They don't need to be that bad. Like, they're really, like, how do you fuck that sort of thing up? Like, listen, I'm the kind of guy, like, I'm cool with, like, Peter Jackson's Kong. Like, just give me that nonsense, you know what I mean?
I couldn't get through that.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of boring scenes in that, but when it's, like, monster indulgence, it's just, like, full on, you know what I mean?
The indulgence stuff is pretty good, but yeah.
Anyway, this is meant to be a music show, not a film show, that I can talk more about those, probably. But anyway, so we'll move on to your next pick, I suppose. Here you go. Another 2024 release.
Yeah, 2024. We got Nathan Haynes' Notes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Nathan Haynes is like, I guess you would call him like a stalwart of New Zealand's like barely existent jazz scene, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah, he's just this guy that I'm not too familiar with most of his stuff, like, but seemingly from what I've heard, I did upload an album he did from like the early 2000s, which is a sort of a bit more jazzy. Like he sort of runs the gambit of these sort of like jazz fusion sort of people, you know how they sort of, especially in the 21st century, meld it, like sort of do little bits into like every sort of genre.
Mm-hmm.
So like in this case, like what would you call this album? Like a sort of, like for the most part, it's just house music, right? A bit of house, bit of R&B.
With some smooth jazz touches.
Yeah, little bits of that, like little bits of what's his name? You know, the guy, Herbie Mann.
Oh, sure.
Like if Herbie Mann was a contemporary house artist or something, you know, with this very like full, very like electronic production. I'm quite surprised because the guy, I think he's in like his 60s. But he's got like the production sensibilities of a contemporary like EDM artist, you know. Like it just has that very sort of full sound. I love how R&B sounds now, you know. It's sort of like that 80s Matume thing is like once again fully realized, you know. It's right in your face in the mix and really visceral, and especially through like a really good sound system, you know.
How just mesmerizing and sublime is the production for that Jamison song, that I Want You So Bad.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
And that's one of the few music videos that I think is just, what a dance. That's the greatest.
Yeah, R&B and like neo soul, especially that one's doing like
they call that genre, I think, R&B wave, which is just,
because that's like that's like a retro thing, that song for sure.
Just turning R&B into just wave, like synth wave, like just R&B synth.
Yeah.
Oh, what a good idea! I just like that.
Whereas like you
the wave thing's cool.
The soft jazz aspect of this fits in with the dance music, where it almost comes across like a chill wave sort of thing. And I'm like, man, I love how old people are doing that. But yeah, it's sort of like a mesmerizing, like, not like forefront, because I guess it fits more in that like acid jazz world, or it's not like the main dance floor club sort of music. It's just sort of like a bit more low key, right? And then there's like a bunch of like sort of vocalists and a few raps and stuff like that. But and also one of the tracks is called like Slick or Sleek or something, and it's like R&B like IDM or something. That was a sick track. There's just something about like the sort of versatility of jazz artists. I like how they can fit into this sort of contemporary setting very well, and I think this guy was probably I think he has a few of these sort of albums from the 90s, but this one felt very like 2024, you know, because these sort of styles of like lighter house, like jazzy R&B have been around since the 90s, right? But just not with this sort of heavy sort of emphasizing deep production, you know, and the sort of like I think where like a jazz artist can like really interpret something like house or dance music in the best possible ways. Like, you know, something like house is just so repetitive. Yeah. Where like when a jazz artist gets like in touch with that sort of structure, I feel they know exactly when the changes need to come in. Like, it gets repetitive, so you get into the groove, but then just as it's about to get too repetitive, boom, the change comes in, and suddenly something else happens, you know? Mm-hmm. And, like, this album just has that sort of sense of perfect timing, you know, I feel, where, like, just as something was just about to be too repetitive, boom, the change came in, you know? Yeah, like I just found it so fascinating. I like that like older artists can still make really like on the point music, you know, because I'm all for like Adam East or like really young people, but when like a veteran doesn't lose touch, like even John Cale's still making kind of interesting albums, you know. When like an elder statesman or a stalwart of music really makes a good contemporary album, I just. Or even like Bowie's last album, you know.
We praised Deep Purple with Whoosh.
Yeah, that was a good one for sure. Yeah, like I find it really fascinating because like there's just certain like sensibilities and touches that come with experience, and when they're not squandered with a sort of like imitation of like youthful songwriting or something, like say the New Pixies album, you know, you miss out with stuff like that. Whereas with stuff like this, like I'm just like if you played this for like someone who was like a house band from the 2000s, they'd probably just think it was like, you know, the newest cutting edge thing. They wouldn't realize it's like a stalwart of an obscure like island, you know. Anyway, what do you reckon?
Oh, well, it's good you mentioned cutting edge of 2000s house, because it sounded very more 2000s to me than 2020s. Maybe
the styling, sure, yeah.
And like I found the production a bit. I do think it's a very good album. I found the production a bit kind of slightly thin, and I feel like it's very precise and very sort of cool in that sort of jazz sense, and very that modern sort of digital jazz sense, and like. I feel like it didn't pop as much as I would have liked it to be honest. And the compositions are there, I think. And like it is very good, and maybe a bit long for me as well, and a bit repetitive stylistically, a little bit. But it makes me think of like something like in the late 70s, early 80s, former members of Soft Machine, Mike Ratledge and Phil Jenkins, I believe was the other one's name. But what they did was they have this act called Rubber. It's just like library music, and it's not necessarily jazzy, but it really just pops and it's alive. And I don't know if it's just I don't think it's necessarily a thing of analog versus digital. There is like a very bouncy quality to the music of that group of Rubber, with Jenkins and Ratledge. And I think like with something like this, it's so like very cool, and it's like dare I say it's like that sort of quasi Muzak sort of like put it on to sort of chill vibe the room music in the best possible way. Highly listenable, and I did really enjoy it, but I did notice a certain coldness to the of what was meant to be sort of like lively music. I mean, and in terms of like listening to it, just purely admire the precision of the playing. It is quite straightforward. I mean, very catchy, but like it doesn't bounce as much as I would want it to. It sounds like music that was produced to be admired for the playing, more so like Steely Dan or something. But it lacks also the sort of totally like sort of all over the place unpredictability of like the best of Steely Dan, of all what everyone's doing, like, you know, this sort of bebop art pop thing of that Becker and Fagan. But yeah, like it's very good, but like I just it makes me think of like what's it maybe like we spoke of Soft Machine members earlier, like maybe like when Soft Machine were getting toward the end and they're just sort of like playing these big long complex pieces, but they're sort of just like going on, and they're very entertaining moment to moment, but there's something that's like missing from the sort of like that sort of like frenetic wash of like 3 and 4, you know what I mean? Even though those aren't as, you know, considered and sort of, you know, noted, let's say. Well, this album's called Notes, funnily enough. No, it's. I feel bad saying this because like I'm sure this is like, and because it's very good. Like if we're going to go for a rating system, it's like it's probably at least an A-, frankly. Yeah. I guess I'm just explaining where the minus comes from.
Well, it's not trying to be music that is like that.
Yeah, I know that. That's unfair of me to say that in a way, but I can't really not say that. I can't not be honest about this.
Like it's the sort of thing where, like, even you mentioned the production, like, really is meant for, like, a big sound system, you know? And also, like it's key what you said, the key point of it is that, like, it is, like, musicians' music, you know?
Yeah.
It's not music in the sense of, like, outside of its sort of aesthetic being the chill thing you described. Like I mentioned, it's sort of the... Like, when I listen to something like house music, unless I'm dancing to it, like, it just sort of bores me to death.
Oh, really? Okay,
Yeah, unless you get the house music that, like, acid house is a different thing. Right? That's, like, psychedelic and in your face. Whereas, like, a sort of, like, the house that, like, has a sort of a jazzy change that comes in at the right moment, as I described. It's that sort of, I guess, musicians. Like, this guy, I think, like, plays, like, New York and London... and New Zealand, but doesn't play Australia.
Oh.
And I think that makes sense in my mind, because it's the sort of music that, like, Australians just don't, you know, really, like we have a strange sort of, like, sentimental approach to music, I feel. Whereas, like, somewhere like New York or London, you know, especially the jazz scenes of like, the sort of older people, they have that sort of very, like, particular... like musician, like even appreciating music just for, like, the musicianship sort of thing. Yeah. Which is, the sort of world this comes from. So I agree with you there, for sure. But yeah, whoever played drums on that, like, Sleek track though, man, they can fucking play drums.
Yeah, it's unfair of me to sort of, I guess, in a way compare it to club music or soundtrack / library music. Now, expecting that it is closer to sort of, like, you know, a cooler jazz exercise.
It's closer to, like, it's like a house herb album, you know.
Yeah, that's a good way. That's a great way of putting it. That's all the anything interesting I've got to share about this one.
Yeah,
very good though. Really a fan. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, no, it's not the greatest album ever. I just thought it was a neat new one, and
it's important to, and I love, like, promoting quality stuff like this. It would be one of the better releases of the year.
Yeah, well, it seems
any
like,
year really.
For example, it has more, like, of an audience than that Nap Eyes album, funnily enough. But, like, it seems to be just from New Zealand. Whereas on, say, like, RYM, Nap Eyes might have about, like, 50, 60 ratings on that new album. Whereas, like, the New Zealand one has, like, just me. I'm the only one who's rated it.
Yeah, it is.
Whereas, like, on YouTube it's got, like, thousands of listens. Probably just people from New Zealand.
Yeah, enthusiasts. Yeah.
Yeah, or something like their radio or something.
Yeah, so you see, we found Australia wouldn't give the guy attention because Australia doesn't have much of a jazz scene. Well, obviously New York and London would, big cities, metropolitan capitals like that, you know.
Yeah, exactly. You can play there. You'll have gigs for sure.
I mean, I say capitals. New York City's not a capital as such. I just meant, like, international sort of hubs, you know.
Cultural capital.
Yeah, the capital of New York State's Albany, right?
Yeah, it's probably Albany.
Yeah, something like, yeah. Anyway, so if we're moving on from Nathan Haynes, I believe it's time for this release was unleashed in the 2010s, but recorded from 1978 to 1983. So it's a little bit of a cheat. But do you all remember when I claimed that I may have felt that the album The Willows of Bellevue probably is the greatest release I've ever heard in my life thus far? Well, there's another album like that, actually, you know, dethroning the likes of Bowie's Low, you know, his Taking Tiger Mountain Pie Strategy. And it's this Jerry and the Hologram self-titled archival release. Now, this came out in March 2017, as I said, recorded from 78 to 83. Now, I'd heard the song before, Jerry and the Holograms. I heard the name Jerry and the Holograms because Zappa would talk about them in an interview or two. And the name Jerry and the Holograms, that sounds... And then we know of the name Jerry and the Pacemakers, but the Holograms just sound like the most goofy sort of, like, 50s group. Like, no one would name yourselves the Holograms out of passion, you know what I mean? But these guys did it in, like, a kind of a lovingly ironic way, you know?
Bonzo Dog Band.
The Holograms.
So, yeah.
Like I said, was there a Gem in the Holograms? That's a show, right?
I'm not sure.
Gem in the, that's totally a thing, right? Yeah, Gem on the Holograms is a thing. Excuse me. Oh, from the 80s. From the 80s. It's after this.
Okay.
I thought it may have been the... I'm confusing it with like when Josie and the Pussycats would have been.
Yeah.
But this is like an 80s
And Mork
show.
and Mindy was a show.
The holograms or...
No, that's got nothing to do with anything. I just wanted to say that.
Oh. But no, so I heard the song, which is just Jerry and the Holograms from Jerry and the Holograms, and it's one of, like, I know what, like, if I say that this is one of my favorite, greatest things I ever heard, you're saying, people can, you're just saying that because it's like contrarian and because it's like ironic. It's like, no, I genuinely think it's beautiful and betwixting and like one of the most immediately, the moment I heard this song, I was never going to forget this song. Like, Jerry and it's almost like specifically designed like that in a sort of like dead board, sort of like a situation, sort of Brechtian manner. Like it's just very designed specifically, like to like just you forever remember it. Like it's like you're very like almost malevolently psychologically designed for that, but you love the experience so much, so you kind of I feel bad for calling it malevolent,
No, it's like that hook. I don't think Trevor is good for you. It's like that sort of when you get a hook that taps into that world you're talking about. But also this one is mixed in with that like gonzo 60s like Mad Magazine, even though that's probably later on. But you get what I mean, that sort of Animal House thing, right? Is Jerry and the Holograms. It feels like the frat like residence parody.
Yeah.
Which like apparently just it makes sense that like Frank Zappa was the champion of this band, right? Like the only person championing it, right?
I assume so. Yeah, the guy, a couple of people, the drummer is. Do we know who Bruce Mitchell is?
Yeah, he's the guy from the Rudy column. Is he the drummer in this?
Yes.
Nice.
Credited here. And someone named John Scott, who I believe was a producer of some kind.
One thing I noticed about this album is that the drum programming goes through the whole gambit of minimal synth.
Mm.
You know, and it made me think about minimal synth, and I do like disco beat minimal synth, you know, 4 on the floor sort of, and skipping like garage sort of beat minimal synth. But you know the best minimal synth is similar to like Martin DuPont. That they have that, but when they go into that sort of like 16th hi-hat, like almost like proto-trap sort of percussion world, that's when it's really ahead of its time. Like there's one of the songs on this album, it's called like Fourth something.
Oh, sure.
Fourth Wind or something like that. And the sort of the skip beat on that it's a nice
43.
Like, yeah, it's like a cool like tribal sort of pattern. That's a really like ahead of the time sort of minimal synth song. I find it neat when minimal synth goes into that because it's literally the like 808 sort of world, right? Which then like hip hop just drew from later. So you end up with all these strange minimal synth bands that invented like 21st century music somehow.
Yeah. Yeah, and no, because I was going to mention the person from, I guess, the main brain behind the people credited as the members of Jerry and the Holograms, C.P. Lee, Bruce Mitchell, and John Scott. I think John Scott was like a producer, sort of electronica excursionist of some kind. I'll get to that later. But the other person, C.P. Lee, he was known for this sort of, I guess you would call it this, I don't know much about them, but they're like a Manchester-based sort of, it's described as comedy rock, punk rock, musical parody thing called Alberto Y. Los Trios Paranoias, which also featured Bruce Mitchell.
Nice.
And also had Tony Bowers, who was also Rudy Colin.
Okay.
Anyway, I might read out this biography now. This is from Discogs, actually. Jerry and the Holograms. Situationist, indebted, masked art rock studio duo from England, the brainchild of Manchester's C.P. Lee, of Alberto's Y. Los Trios Paranoias, and producer annex electronica excursionist John Scott. They were really a front for all sorts of musical shenanigans. For a long time, their first single was their only recorded output, until more material was unearthed in 2017. Their second single was a conceptual and unplayable anti-record in the Situationist art tradition. Each record came glued into its picture sleeve, rendering the disc completely unplayable even if you managed to tear it free as the glue had destroyed the grooves in the process, rivaling that of Peter Saville and Rudy Collins' Deborahist Sandpaper rehash by at least 3 years. Having risen from the electronic embers of Manchester's first genuine psychedelic band, via Vertigo commissioned prog and experimental theatre, then refined through the musical mind behind the most inspired vinyl moments of Martin Hannett, John Cooper Clarke, and Jilted John, the onlyest discography of the Gaff, Jerry and the Holograms anti-band remains unrivaled as the most idiosyncratic and enigmatic, pivotal post-punk artifact from the first electronic entrenchment of pop. In 1982, the duo would reappear alongside Lol Coxhill in 48 Chairs.
Lol Coxhill's a genius. I gotta hear that album.
48 Chairs is I think it's a band. Incognito trio of Lol Coxhill and the two men behind Jerry and the Holograms.
Nice.
The Discogs.
That's gotta be genius. I still gotta watch that documentary or the concert film.
Oh yeah, I've got that. Nice. Yeah, 48 Chairs. They got one album, 70% Paranoid in 1983.
Nice. I'm sure it's cool.
And a single in 79, Snap It Around / Cycle Sluts. Anyway. But no, like this is... encapsulates the music that I love, and like it's especially important, like that I mentioned that sort of library music I love, and this is all recorded from 78 to 83. That's right in that period when all the Bruton music's coming out, you know, Brian Bennett and all those people, but also that beautiful library music from France, Bernard Fevre and Dominique Guyot, you know.
Analog synthcore.
Moogsploitation they call it now.
Yeah, Moogsploitation.
And what the era of that the
by the late 70s though, it's like beyond Moog.
Yeah, sure.
They have new like even, you know, I don't know the history of the hardware too well, but you know, late 70s library music, like you said, it's such a warm sound.
Yeah, the kind of music that the Ghostbox record label / Bellberry Polly
and then
homaging in the first place.
And that first OMD album.
It does.
Sounds, you know?
Yeah, that's why it's my favourite of their work, actually.
Nice. The first OMD album.
Sorry, no, the organisation, I thought you meant.
Oh, that has those too, but
yeah.
The first album, like, it's more vibrant in the, like, first YMO album.
Yeah, exactly. I compared it to that, a few times, yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit like that.
Yeah, Jerry and the Holograms is right in that world, which is almost like if I have to tell people what my favourite music of all time is, it tends to gravitate to things like Low and Solid Space and this, you know what I mean? And stuff homaging this, which came out later, like Bellberry Polly. And I love this era of sort of the post-war consensus UK sort of like everything's sort of meant to be refined and told to you by an announcer from the BBC, and this is the world, and then you watch the television and these are the guerrillas in the Congo, and this is how the world works, this is the class, this is the election, this is Doctor Who tonight at 11, and Mary Whitehouse is going to protest against it now.
It's like when
the kids won't know if the Doctor has drowned or not for a week.
OMD played Dazzle Ships live, and it's just like a little vocal sample of like a newsreel from the 80s where it's like, and the little girl in Rwanda was muted, and then everyone's just like, woo! Because they know the song's coming on.
Yeah, like that era of it, like when it had that strict sort of consensus, like there was sort of trust and like belief in the state and sort of the post-war socialist sort of you know, healthcare dream, NHS dream. But then there's also like, in that, you also had that thing that was sort of tapped into by programs like Doctor Who, especially during the sort of the black and white era when you could distinguish depictions of London in that show for like, you know, footage from the news. Is like Daleks or Cybermen or Yeti or War Machines, you know, kind of strolling through there. And this idea that like things from the exterior sort of lurking in, like this sort of like potent weird fiction environment, which really I think thrives in the context of that era, and like, you know, interesting television productions like Pandas Fen or just or The Wicker Man, you know, that sort of thing, where like the idea that these sort of things still exist, like lurking and under the surface, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's
sort beautiful.
Of the tropes of cosmic horror. Right?
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, and I didn't think about that, but this album sort of has traces of that. It's funny you mentioned situationless as well, like the way you described the title track, and then afterwards said situationless. I'm like, that's the perfect way to describe the title track. Yeah, like The Residents. It's just this sort of like weird, like absurdist, dramatic interpretation of pop music.
Yeah. It really, really enforces the parameters of recorded music to sort of experiment with, sort of charged, sort of ontological sort of exercises, you know, like make people like do a certain thing with this. It's almost like an experiment in like positive propaganda in a way.
Yeah.
is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, for sure. Positive propaganda. It's a very situationalist sort of experience. Like, what later came along with, like, Illuminatus and KLF and things like that. It sort of eventually matured.
Illuminatus would have preceded this, I assume, right? That's from the early 70s.
No, you're right, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, culture jamming. Yeah.
Culture jamming, yeah. And I guess things that, like, preceded this album as well is, like, who I mentioned earlier, like Negative Land.
Yeah.
Things like that. Eventually situationalist, like, pop music, it sort of matures a bit more. Like, this is very early to it. Maybe the Fugs more so.
Oh, yeah,
But this is like a minimal synth Fugs in a way. More instrumental, though, obviously.
But, I guess I briefly wanted to sort of speculate upon, like, that the post-war consensus era sort of is said to erode or evaporate overnight when sort of the Thatcher election, and she's like, it's all about the market. We can't trust the government and the state, and the taxing's bad, and all we've got to do is just let the market handle everything. Milton Friedman told me, and he promised it would work out. And then we go to war with Argentina over the Falklands in the meantime, and whatever. But no, the whole thing is, it's like, and that sort of busted open. And I wonder and speculate if punk was sort of reacting to that post-war consensus world in a way also, and that it's on the other side of the coin is like sort of the Thatcher, like, disdain for it. I mean, punk was sort of anarchic and apolitical in some respects, but like, just open, its politics were just like hostile to anything. But you wonder if you can sort of put that, like, desire to just sort of let it rip, let it run and raw, sort of it was a similar sort of attempt to erode that post-war consensus, which after a while was seemingly vocally missed by certain even vocal devotees of the punk continuum, like Fisher. And so it has me thinking, what was when that world was extinguished, was it maybe an organic path forward, but was replaced by sort of like more problematic and sort of expose some things which you ought to have maybe tried to preserve about that post-war consensus state of thinking. And so what's missing? And I think it's this sense of everything existing in sort of a communal continuum, you know what I mean? Like, everyone was part of, like the British state was, like, quasi-socialized in that era there, you know what I mean? Like, it was like an attempt to experiment within the democratic socialist parameters, you know what I mean? And, like, we forget it now because a lot of it got eroded during the 80s, but, like, they wanted to be akin to what, like, the Scandinavians, and probably what the Scandinavian states were experimenting concurrently with. But what they are akin to now, it really wanted to evolve into something like that, what those states exist as, and that sort of idealist framework, as we perceive them in the rest of the world. I think to them in Scandinavia it's just life. But obviously, like, the world evolved into something more, as the author Ballard would describe, he probably would think it's quite delicious and interesting, but to us it's sort of like horrifying, and even to those of us who read J.G. Ballard, we often wonder, like, this is sort of fascinating to read about because of its proximity to reality, but also its extremities, that the contemporary world is closer than ever to, like, reading Ballard in the late 20th century would have been kind of, it's exciting, you think about its proximity to the present, and now the proximity of Ballard to the present is like getting closer and closer to the sun, and it's like, it's less pretty and it's more terrifying now. Or a black hole, rather.
Speaking of Empire of the Sun.
Yeah. No, like, I guess what I'm... I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, it would be interesting to compose a new sort of, like, consensus from a sort of, like, punk continuum, you know what I mean? Like, a sort of, because punk's sort of so scattered and individualist in its way, in that, but it did form, like, a very interesting collective, sort of framework as well, I think.
Well, and like I said earlier,
that will incorporate the sort of trappings of the sort of potential harmful trappings of other collectivist movements prior, and would espouse a sort of, like, individualism that wasn't suffocating to a collective interest, if you know what I'm trying to say.
Well, that's the whole ethos of the anarcho-punk.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that, like, certain bands are classified as anarcho-punk, but then, like, I think of something like the Pop Group, which it completely shares that sentiment. They've never been labelled as anarcho-punk.
Maybe the distinction that people were classifying as what the music sounds like.
I suppose so, because like there's a certain like death rock quality to anarcho-punk, you know. But yeah, the politics is exactly the same. That's sort of like...
Yeah, seemingly it is, yeah.
Yeah, like a hyper-individualistic sort of like yearning for like community, you know.
Maybe the punk group is more specifically socialist or Marxist than maybe the anarcho-punk was more interested in Bakunin and that sort of thing, you know.
Yeah, well,
that sort of tract of revolutionary, sort of radical political thinking. I don't know the anarchist writers as well as I ought to.
Well, the anarchos, they're pretty much just socialists as well. They're like anarchist socialists, you know.
Yeah, anarcho-syndicalists, that's the term. I
guess so. That's probably what more they fit into, you know.
Mm.
But yeah, there's a ground for like a punk philosophy, for sure. Like, and like there is a sort of zealotry in punk, but like in any sort of philosophical movement, I suppose it's just like at least in punk, like for the most part, you by the nature of it, you can sort of weed out zealotry, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But then once again, there's also a sort of cynical aspect to punk where at the same time you can weed out zealotry. You can watch documentary or like, you know, live shows like where all the old people were like, "What is punk?" with John Lydon and Henry Rollins and Marky Ramone, and it's like so opposite to what punk is that none of them are like punk anymore in the practical sense, you know.
Yeah. By
pontificating the sort of theoretical aspects of it, there's a sort of like immediacy to it where it's so like I don't know, if we think about the sort of working class movement of the, you know, the union movement of the 20th century that eventually like worked out things like the work world we live in now that's slowly being eroded away. Things like the 8-hour day, full-time payment, medical benefits, things like that, right?
Mm.
That came out of like a time it solidified after the Depression and after the war where like workers were really needed, you know?
Yeah.
And eventually people had the leverage. And that's the sort of immediacy where punk can really take over, you know? Where people have the leverage again. Like in the sort of political and like economic toil of late 70s England, 70s and like late 70s England, it seems that's why punk took over. But then when Thatcher like took in and was like, the upper class are going to take the wheel again, you know?
Yeah.
That's where punk sort of goes underground again, you know? It's completely gone from the mainstream. It's just top of the pops after that, you know? Yeah, I think there's a relationship there. I don't know, I might be wrong, but like something about the immediacy of like, you know, like for example, in the case of like Sydney at the moment, I feel the sort of actual solidarity of people in the majority would only come when like the economic and realty bubble eventually pops. Like it's inevitably going to do it at some point in time, right? Like it always does, and then we have to build again. But that it'll only like that sort of immediacy will only come when it finally pops.
Yeah.
And the whole like momentum of the economic ruling classes has just been to keep that going as long as it can, you know, because their biggest fear is it popping. Even though in the end, like they won't get hit as hard as like the majority does when it does pop. But they're more terrified than the majority are. Because even though they'll get hit harder, we'll finally be the ones with that sort of power leverage, you know?
Yeah.
Like democracy might actually go full circle, finally eat its tail again, you know?
That'd be Ouroboros fun, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's the theoretical idea of democracy, but too much of like the economic ruling classes is like sort of like, you know, take advantage of that being like a sort of nature, you know, or our job is to step on you until you step on us, and it's like that's such a silly way to go in circles, you know.
Yeah.
It's in circles. We're idiots. Anyway.
Oh, other anarchist thinkers that listed on libcom.org here, other than Bakunin: Peter Kropotkin, Pierre Joseph Proudhon, Emma Goldman, Rudolf Rocker, Gustav Landauer, Alexander Berkman, Errico Malatesta, Johann Marston, Elisée Reclus.
Nice.
Anyway, I just figured those are the anarchist thinkers that some of them I'm not very familiar with, frankly. I know of Proudhon and Goldman, but not significantly at all. Anyway,
but yeah, it feels appropriate for Jerry and the Holograms.
Yeah, no, this is going to be, if I have to assemble little lists of like top 5 best, this is a top 5 deserver for me. Like, this is just, every track on here is like, you got early trip hop tracks, you got early just like EBM tracks. It's like a more minimal wave, like Patrick Cowley at times. It's just absolutely, I could go on about Patrick Cowley, and like one of the albums that would, if I was to discuss Patrick Cowley on Mandala, it would be the Catholic archival album released in 2009.
That's a good one.
The material from the late 70s, which is with him and
this is a bit like that. That's true. That's
the one that's most similar to this. But even some of the stuff on like in the archival releases, like Afternooners and Muscle Up, like or School Days are a bit similar, but like depend. They're all over they're a bit of everything sometimes. But yeah, that's all the interesting I have to share about this anyway.
No, it's a good one. I guess we'll move on to the last.
Here we go.
The ultimate Halloween pick, I suppose.
Oh yeah, it is too, isn't it?
Yeah, sorry, I have to hit it because this album is terrifying. I guess I picked it because I was thinking I haven't heard this album in ages because it's seemingly like unstreamable, except for I did ask my brother, and apparently it is available on Spotify. Oh. Which in that case it might be one of the only albums that like they just won't let on YouTube, but is on Spotify. Like, that's rare. It's normally the opposite way around, funnily enough, right?
Yeah, seemingly is, yeah.
But anyway, like, this is sort of... Yeah, I guess I picked it because I hadn't heard it in quite a while, and, like, I just sort of love this album. It's like a staple of... I was never really a metalhead, but and, like, crossover, like, punk metal never really... Like, it's a bit hit and miss, right? Like, I was never really, like, a Suicidal Tendencies fan or those sort of bands. Like Discharge are pretty good. There's a few of them out there that, like, do sort of rip, but something about, like, this album... then Acid Bath's next album, When the Kite String Pops, sorry, I brought it up, Acid Bath, When the Kite String Pops. I was never as big on their next album, for example, the Pagan Terrorism Attacks or something.
Yeah.
Whereas there's something about, like, I guess as well, I just haven't picked, like, a metal album on the show, because, like, typically I'm not the biggest sort of metal guy, but this is, like, when I think of the potentials of heavy metal, like, this is one of the albums I just think of, because it's such a, like, it's a very 90s album.
Yeah.
So you sort of, I guess you think of it in that context. If I had, like, a top 5 albums of the 90s, I'd easily put this in there.
Oh, yeah.
Because, like, it's that good. Like, I do love, like, Dope Smoker by Sleep as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But that's a weird sort of case where it's, like, a 90s album, but it's not as well in release.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, yeah, that whole thing.
Whereas this is just, like, it's more than just the stoner metal, though. It's like a bit of the stoner. People obviously say, like, you know, sludge. This is like the sludge album. But it's also like thrash, groove. It's like sort of every little bit of metal, you know. It's even got like post-grunge elements. And I always thought like he does that sort of singing like that. But it turns out, I actually read today, apparently he was inspired by like Roy Orbison to do that like sort of melodic... Like, apparently on the record, they credit the ghost of Roy Orbison. And I was like, that's hilarious.
Oh, wow.
I never even thought of it in that context.
I never would have guessed this.
I know. Listening to it again today, I was like, man, there's just something about this band. They have a sort of... And I also found out they're from Louisiana, which just seemed to make sense as well. Mm-hmm. Once again, something about the Creole. But yeah, it's just... You know how so much metal, like, you've described hip-hop before as, like, a sort of posturing of, like, you know, aggression or something like that. I feel that way about so many, especially, like, 90s metal albums, where something like this comes along, and it really feels like that sort of visceral aggression realized in an actual sort of, like, soulful way, in the sense of, like, it just gets in touch with the, like, you know, for example, John Wayne Gacy is the album cover, right? So it taps into that sort of like serial killer aspect of metal that's always just like surface level, you know. It's like the difference between like just a hack serial killer movie and like Henry Portrait of a Serial Killer, you know, to use the movie analogies again. It's like a fully realized like state of the human condition, especially in the late 20th century, of just like complete paranoia and like sort of like mental case, right? Fully realized with all these sort of like on top of that, it's just, like just in musical form, you know. It's I don't know. It's just like what I wish most metal actually was in a way, you know, like purely visceral and purely like there's no posturing here. It feels real, you know. It's actual like punk metal in a sense, right? Yeah, like I don't know. This album sort of terrifies me. Like as I listen to it, it puts you in such a weird headspace. It's not like an everyday listen or like a, you know, that's why I love it. It's so unique for that. Like so much metal is just like, you know, people listen to it every day. I don't get it. Like because it doesn't actually, the actual music doesn't embody what the sound and aesthetic is. Whereas the sound and aesthetic of this album is metal, right? It is that sort of demonic entity in every person, you know, especially metal fans, especially the like mental gymnastics of metal fans. You know, the often cited thing where there's some like pop psychology study that says like metal heads are the most like level-headed and happiest people in the world because they get it all out through the metal or whatever. Like that's the dumbest shit I've ever heard. Like they're metalheads are like that because they're like a bit dull. Like it's not like if anything it's just because, you know, they're just not thinking enough, you know. And whereas I feel like something like this feels like it's actually tortured metal. Like, you know, it's like I mentioned even before that like it's very 90s and a bunch of the genres. It's even contemporary in the sense that it's like new metal in the way that like a Korn or a you know, the Iowa band. Slipknot. Or like Marilyn Manson.
Yeah.
Like, well, they wish they could. Like, they're just. You know, this is actually that. It's fully tangible and, you know. It's what I wish most metal was, in a way. That's sort of why I feel like I've always just, like, really. This album was so immediate for me in a way that, like, you know, Black Sabbath is for so many metalheads, because they do occupy that space right at the start, right? And like, yeah, the second I heard the opening riff from say like Master of Reality, I was like, yeah, you know, boom, right there. And so this is sort of like that as well, but I might have even heard this before Master of Reality, funnily enough. But yeah, it's for me, this is sort of like, I guess, what most metalheads would consider like Master of Reality or something like that, you know. It's John Wayne Gacy is somehow the best metal album for me.
Yeah, I mean, he's like self-portrait of that.
Yeah.
No, this is it's funny, like the sonic ancestor of like the free 2020s metal albums that I've had praise for on this show, Absent Bodies, Plague God, King Buffalo's, I can't remember what that's called, that's from 21.
Yeah, with the big skull.
Yeah,
that was a good one.
Burden of Restlessness.
Yeah.
And Toad Liquor's Back in the Hole from this year, actually.
With the baby.
Yeah. It looks like almost like an earlier form of the Born Again Black Sabbath baby. You know?
A little bit, yeah.
I actually quite like that album.
It's the Vaporwave Born Again.
The Born Again with Gillan. I guess it's not underrated now. There's a lot of fans.
People seem to like it.
I'm quite fond of it personally, actually. But when the Kite String pops, it's like the origin of those albums sound in a way, but it makes me think you, especially when you talk all of that, that discussion there, it's like those albums even can potentially lack the authenticity. Those are just like people from like New York, Belgium, and Toad Liquor might be more legitimate. Toad Liquor from back in the day, actually, and then they kind of got back together to do this album. So I don't know much. Toad Liquor might have had a pretty intense story. If you ever read about like Electric Wizard's like story, like especially back then, like they were criminals.
Yeah.
They were, like, breaking into shops to steal shit. They were just, like, getting into fights, rambunctious vandalism, just, like, not nice people.
Sure.
And they're not proud of it, but they're proud of the music.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
You know, it's just one of those things where, like, so there were bands that did occupy this space, and I don't know, maybe Acid Bath had a more, like, sort of tranquil existence than most. Like, I've heard, like, the deaf guys are, like, relatively, like, easygoing, sort of, I mean, party animals at times, but, like, you know, not, like, rambunctious, sort of, like the black metal people from Scandinavia, how, like, scandalous that genuinely was, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But no, I don't know the story of these guys, if it was, like, really dark and horrifying, but it makes it sound like it was really, just being from the area, and you can imagine an area like Louisiana, sort of swampy and sort of humid and just not considered, like, you know, maybe New Orleans at times of the year, maybe, but maybe not. You know, from Houma, Louisiana, I don't know what, you know, it might not be the most, you know, not exactly New York City, LA as well.
Sure, yeah.
You know, parts of Chicago, whatever. But, like, it's just, like, so raw and uncompromising and evil. It is one of the top metal albums I could claim to have ever heard. I remember this was introduced to me as, like, you know, on, like, I think it's like a subreddit I briefly looked at when I was in year 11. This is quite a while ago now, I guess.
Like some metal subreddit or something.
Yeah, and then, like, there was all the metal albums everyone talks about. But then there was, like, I think it was, like, another subreddit that was sort of like, oh, no, this is the real thing. Or, like, it's, like, underrated. And when the Kite String pops and I saw the cover, I was like, yeah, I'll check it out. And you're listening to it and you're like, man, like, getting into this, you got to be in, like, a weird space. Like, I admired it in a very objective sense. I admired it. But, like, I couldn't get through it. I was just like, holy moly. Like,
yeah.
Like, he's just not, I just don't know if I'm in the headspace. I think there's a lot of other stuff I have to be a fan of before diving into this sort of thing. Because that wasn't even the biggest. It took me a while to warm up to something like Slayer even. Ooh, Death. I wasn't a Death fan at any point. Like, I became a Slayer fan by the time I graduated high school. Like, very much so. But Death eluded me for a couple of years.
See, bands like Slayer and Death, Acid Bath, they do it in, like, a raw artistic way, whereas, like, I don't know, Cannibal Corpse, Meshuggah.
Yeah.
It's like a sort of a bit more of a plain way, I feel, you know.
I didn't realize this, but, like, there's a little bit of, like, in, like, the sort of, like, heavy, extreme metal world, there's a bit of, like, people, like, seemingly turn their nose up at Cannibal Corpse a bit, like they were sort of, like, the dumbed down of the death metal bands.
Sure.
I could be misconstruing this, but, like,
so maybe.
That's, like, sort of the impression I got. Where some people, like, I swear I've heard on Sea Tranquility from some of those guys more than once, I was never into Cannibal Corpse that much. I was like, huh, really? Well, aren't they? Well, I guess. So, but you do get the impression that they're not as, like, esteemed as, like, obviously Death and, like, some of the bands surrounding that, like, In Flames or whatever.
Because they're the band that leaned more into the edgy aesthetic as, like, the crux of it.
Yeah, you think about the lyrics and sort of the content of the album artwork.
Whereas,
you know.
whereas this has that edgy aesthetic and the artwork, but then you think about the music and you're like, man, this music is a genius. If it was arranged in jazz, it would sound brilliant.
Yeah, I reckon it might.
It's that sort of thing.
Yeah. What jazz artist would this belong to if it was jazz? That's an interesting question. Maybe some experimental, like, Eastern European jazz artists. I don't know.
You could probably do it in a few different sort of styles. You could probably do it in a bop and do it in, like, a...
I'm trying to think of who would come up with it, you know what I mean? Like, it would...
Yeah,
such a strange...
Sure.
Oh, man. It's fascinating to think about. But I'm not sure. But no, it is quite brilliant. And, yeah, very happy to have it discussed here today. Because it's not something I think to listen to very much, but it's also... I think where metal becomes really even legitimized as, like, a sort of an excursion in the first place, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's certainly not a sunny day album.
No.
It's a bit...
Even though I did listen to it today.
Yeah, it's a bit like something like Spiderland, you know?
Ooh.
It's that sort of, like, avant-garde world, you know? You really do, like, sort of step into the extremities of the human condition. when listening to something like this, right?
You know what the problem I have with other metal compared to this, like the other metal's like sort of like play pretend, as you were kind of I guess you're saying earlier, like
sure,
sort of dressing up as Vikings, and the power metal thing is like obviously nothing to do with this world.
And
a lot of it kind of even a lot of the extreme metal sort of stuff is a little power metal-y to me in that respect. It's very sort of surface level, you know what I mean?
Through the fire and the flames.
Well, I mean, they're sort of like they're considered sort of crap by like the elitists, from what I understand.
I'm sure.
Dragon Force, but
they're called Dragon.
From what I understand, they know about this sort of thing. Anyway, I'm not a metal.
The Asia of metal.
Maybe I don't know if that's the case, but you have to ask them, I suppose. Fandom of metal, but yeah, like there's just lacking this sort of like really it makes you really ill, you know, like there's not much metal, there's not much music that does this quite to the same effect, is there? Like I can think of like films that do this. I don't know many album recorded music that does this.
Yeah,
I mean there's some like disturbing segments
especially
of like the Frothy Gristle family, but this is pretty fucking...
It's a bit different,
yucky, you know?
Yeah. It does it in a way that's like... And it's not like off-putting. Like I would describe, like say, like something like Cannibal Corpse. So I'm like, I just don't want to listen to it. Like I'm still intrigued as I'm listening to this horrible stuff happening. Maybe a bit like Ballard again to evoke him, like Crash or something, you know?
Oh, yeah.
It's like you're watching a car wreck. And there's a sort of like weird fascination. Though on that note, I was sort of like disgusted by like the Australian news yesterday because it was like a car crash at like a primary school.
Oh.
And the fucking like some woman in a SUV, as I keep saying is gonna happen, fucking goes to do like a U-E and like plows into the fucking playground where like kids are sitting on a table. And the news showed like a helicopter shot of the car. And you could just see, like, a kid's legs poking out under the car. And I'm like, why are they showing that? That's terrible.
Yeah.
It reminded me of this album. I was like, man, this is, like, awful. I can't believe that was just on, like, mainstream news. They normally blur shit out. But I was like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Why are they showing, like...
Are they just not caring anymore? Like, that's nuts.
Man, I was like, what the fuck? Yeah, people got to get off their phones as they drive.
Yeah, that's intense. That's horrifying.
If anyone like drives when they're surfing their phone, you got to listen to this album every day until you stop doing that.
Yeah,
that's like a good resolution, I reckon. You have to listen to when the kite string pops.
Maybe like people like that like got to have like this is like implying a lot of governmental control, but like banned from having a smartphone and they have to use like a cell phone where they can't browse the internet.
Oh, they got to use a Nokia.
Yeah, something like that. They're like government issued Nokias, you know.
That's a good punk band name, government issued Nokias.
Or like the kind of fine which like would, oh man, like break. I don't know. Like you just gotta like.
Yeah, well, if people have to like breathe into their cars, like you know, if they've been done with a DUI. Like, they put a breathalyzer in the engine, then a government-issued Nokia is not outside the realm of possibility.
Yeah.
Why not?
No, that's true. They do have those.
Yeah, they got those, for sure.
Yeah, I totally forgot that those exist. But, you know, and as well, like, maybe, they could be, I could be wrong, because I know the fines are quite, they do, the government and the police do take it very seriously if they see people on their phones while they're driving. They'll come down hard on you, rightfully so, I think.
Even though I've seen cops do it too.
No, yeah, it's fucking disgusting.
I kind of laughed. I was like, oh my god.
But, it would be interesting if they made the penalties the equivalent of, like under the influence of alcohol. That might be an interesting world. Where, like, it's like a license losing sort of offense, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think you could get to that world depending if the statistics, I hope it doesn't come to because of this reason, but if the statistics come to represent that, you know what I mean, like, then that may very well become the case, because that's why they made the drink driving penalties so severe, because of how much it was occurring, and it's horrible that it took so many people being murdered for that to be the case. You know, not legally mad, but, you know, for his expression, you know, killed. But yeah, it's the sort of morbid discussions which occur when the kite string pops is discussed.
Of course. But also, like, in the sort of positive sense, just people, if you're out there, like, walking around, because I'm always out there walking around, and in like, areas of high construction density, you notice that, like, even people driving, like, cement trucks and, like, construction trucks are just, like, on their phones.
Really?
Yeah, in a weird way, like, they drive trucks all the time. So in a weird way, it's, like, more second nature for them. Still, I think it's fucked up. But, like, even when people driving, like, giant, the sort of truck that could just level anything are on their phones, it's just so conditioned in our brains where people aren't even, like, regarding that as, like, an issue,
No, like...
I think it's kind of absurd.
The smartphone thing it really does horrify me. Like, I just, like, I'm one of these people, like, just as a brief aside, like I do get genuinely, like, kind of put off when... For the most part, like, I think in some circumstances it's perfectly fine, like, but like if you're not at the center of, like, I guess you're at a gathering and, like, there's up to 7 people gathered, and, like, if someone's, like, flicks through their phone for, like, a minute or two, like, I don't consider that impolite personally anyway, but like, I think if it gets to a point where, like, if people just start, like, doing it, I'm just like, if they're, like, just after they've been talking, or, like, during, or, like, I'm just like, what are you doing? Like, it's just such a, like, I just don't understand. It's like flipping through a phone book in the middle of, it's like, what the fuck are you doing? It's like flipping through a newspaper or a magazine while you're discussing. It's like, why? It's just like, what the fuck are you here for? Like, read the magazine elsewhere,
Yeah.
It gets to a point, like, I don't know, like, whipping out smartphones at certain times is just, like, a bit obnoxious to me personally.
That does sound like a Bill Burr or Louis C.K. bit from, like, 2009.
No, but I grew up with this stuff, and I've always felt this.
No, I do agree, of course, but I just...
I mean, unfortunately, it sounds like hack crap like that. Yeah. That's just, I hate to agree with them, but they're agreeing with me,
Well, the reason why those bits resonated at that time was because, it's the feeling. Of course. I think it still is for the most part. But, definitely. And, like, I brought it up because I think it is also a sort of, like, parasitic aspect of, like, intersocial communication, Especially, but funnily enough, though, it does sort of... It is an expansion of, like, 2008 internet logic, where people even back then would say, we've got this resource that has all the information of human knowledge ever accumulated, but people use it to watch cat videos.
Yeah.
And that hasn't changed. That's essentially the logic we've been running on for the last 20 years.
Yeah, it wasn't all encompassing. The internet was just like a computer in your house at one time, but...
No, that's true.
It wasn't as all encompassing and omnipresent as it is now.
Well, it started in, like, 2008, 2009, though. That's when everyone started getting iPhones or iPod Touches.
Yeah, by, like, 2011, it was just solidified.
Yeah. I even remember, like, 2009, term 4 in 2009, year 7 for me. Like, everyone had an iPod Touch at the end of the year. Like, literally everyone. I
remember that. Yeah.
In fact, everyone had an iPod Touch to the point where they made fun of the one kid who got an iPhone. Because in 2009, everyone had, like, a Nokia or, like, a Sony Ericsson and an iPod Touch. Because you could, like, call and just use your phone through that. It was easier. And then the iPod Touch was all the games and apps and the internet.
Yeah.
And the only difference was with the iPhone and the iPod Touch was that you could call people on the iPhone at that time.
Yeah.
And it was like $800 more expensive. So they made fun of the one kid who had one.
His parents got him one, yeah.
Yeah, his parents got him one. They're like, bro, you can just have one of this and this. Like, what the fuck?
Jesus.
That was a weird time, eh? That's right on the cusp of the change,
Yeah, older people, if they were ever listening to this conversation, they'd be like, you spoiled brats are talking about what? But, like, it's like a very common thing. Like, I guess we were in, like, an upper middle class suburb, to be fair.
It's the difference between, like...
Gadgetry was, like, this seemingly, like, super, like, high-tech and privileged gadgetry is just the norm. It's just, like, as normal as having a fucking watch, in a way.
Yeah.
It's fucked, but I agree. But, like,
well, watches are less normal now.
Well, exactly, yeah. I mean, like, what that was at one time, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I won't go into my watch spiel, but that's the whole thing.
Okay.
But yeah, definitely. The iPod Touches, man, they were everywhere. For sure.
I guess the reason partly I never really resonated with like the whole like people on the smartphones and I was just like found it off-putting. Because like I was never really a smartphone. I mean, I have a fucking phone, obviously, but like I was a computer person. Like I was always like the kid on the computer at home. Like I just never really like if I want to use the internet, like trying to transition to using the internet on a smartphone, I'm just like, ew. Like I mean, if I'm in public, I'm trying to like want to read an article, like I'm in a waiting room, like it's nice, but like like I just as easily like listen to music on like use the phone as an iPod, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like so there's just that, you know what I mean? So that's not really browsing the internet. I guess so, yeah, that's a good point. But like I don't know, like I just never really just looking at the screen like that, trying to zoom in with my two fingers, like I just find it a bit frustrating, to be honest.
It's only good as like the Nintendo DS on the go version of the internet.
Yeah, I just use the internet and like reading online enough at home.
Interfacing with a computer, like a desktop,
I do it enough that like when I move to a smartphone, I'm just like I can't even, to be honest. But like and yeah, like I don't use social media, so like I just got no reason to just like apps, like the phone's nothing to me. Like I don't need it. I literally just use it for calls for the most. And like the instances I'm for like as an iPod slash, like read the internet in a waiting room if ever. It's just I don't know. Like I just never really took to it as like something I was very like passionate about using beyond it being like purely functional. You know what I mean?
Sure.
This is like a tool.
YouTube's a social media, but I suppose you're probably using it in more of the functional sense. Similar to like that guy I was describing who was singing the like Iliad, who's just been releasing music consistently,
I think what YouTube's distinct from a social media app is it's not really like I guess you could say it's shifting in that direction slightly. But its intent was like sort of video in the website category of like video sharing, you know what I mean? Whereas like I feel like the whole idea of like profiles and sort of like accumulating sort of like connections like in that very MySpace / Facebook / Twitter way, that very profile sense. I guess Tumblr in a respect to it, but Tumblr was different in that it was like anonymous, you know what I mean? So it was sort of a mixture of a couple of things. I feel like YouTube was a bit distinct from that, but at the same time, it is effectively evolving into you're watching a lot of these channels because of his personality. You know what I mean? It's like, I mean, there was elements of that. I mean, I never really liked the idea of like YouTube for like YouTube's sake. You know what I mean? Beyond it being just like a venue. You know what I mean? Like people
who treat really a Smosh fan.
Well, yeah, people who treat YouTube as like a unique, distinct venue for unique creations. I'm not really into that so much as it just being like, like just some sort of visual library. You know what I mean?
The title of YouTuber and also content creator is so
anything to do with that is just like garbage.
Those two titles are so like nondescript.
Just calling it content is so cynical. It's just like how are you excited to wake up and you're not excited to wake up in the morning if you're just referring to as content.
Whoa.
You can't use a more banal term
to
describe any media.
That comes from like the television industry as well.
Oh, sure. Well,
that's literally
the heritage of trash.
That was their like vernacular from that era, right? Yeah. Is content. I can't believe that's the one that carried over, right? Yeah. It just shows you how they view art, right?
It's so disgusting.
It's content. Yeah.
But it's just like it's one of those things.
I suppose the moon landing was content.
Good content, to be fair. As far as that sort of thing goes. But yeah, it's always been discussed with YouTube in that respect. And, you know what? I really got to plug this back into the charger, unfortunately.
Yeah,
so I'll just cut the episode here. We finished the album discussion effectively, just winding on about a bunch of other stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate you listening, if you have done so.